Bet the Board.
What do you mean you don't bet? I mean, I don't bet. You know, I don't gamble. I don't. I never have, and I never will. Yeah, right. I'll bet you $20 I can get you gambling before the end of the day.
You owe me 15 grand, pal.
Pay him. Pay that man his money.
It's the Bet the Board podcast.
God likes me. He really, really likes me.
In the end, I wound up right back where I started. I could still pick winners, and I could still make money for all kinds of people back home. And why mess up a good thing?
Here's Payne Insider and Todd Fuhrman.
Welcome in to the Bet the Board podcast, continuing the college football off-season previews portion of the program. 2 Power 4 conferences in the can, a big one on the horizon today. It's all about Big Ten football and the expanding footprint. I'm your host, Todd Fuhrman, joined as always by my esteemed colleagues and co-host on these college football shows, Payne Insider and Brad Powers. Gentlemen, 2 Power 4 conferences down, 2 to go.
You could say these are the super power conferences, Big Ten and SEC, the way things are going.
I mean, these may be the only 2 power conferences that are left. No knocks meant for Payne's beloved ACC, but it feels like a separation of the haves and have-nots. Although, Payne, when we were going through trying to figure out which teams to break down in this league, there's a real separation from a top-heavy league and a far cry from a Big 12 where it felt like a very muddled middle in terms of a number of legitimate conference championship candidates.
Yeah, it's the inverse of the Big 12. You know, it's Oregon and Ohio State, a nice little dip to Penn State, has a chance with an easier schedule to squeak into the playoff, and then you dip down to like a USC level. So it's a really interesting Big Ten. We're actually going to adhere to the conference name. We're going to deep dive 10 schools. We'll get into a few more in the later portion of the podcast, but looking forward to this. And honestly, I cannot believe this is where we're going to start the Big Ten, but here we are, Iowa.
I mean, there's only one place to start with the gold standard and the dean of Big Ten head coaches, Kirk Ferentz and Iowa City. And when we look at the Iowa Hawkeyes, their win total sits at 7.5. They're about a 40-1 long shot to win the conference. Win totals tick down a touch in terms of juice. We've seen their conference odds drift out. And when we look at Iowa, we can say everything we want about this team setting offensive-minded football back to the 1890s, but they did just put their 11th straight season with a winning record on the books. Fewest points per game, though, at 15.4 by a 10-win team in Division I history last year, going all the way back to 1973. And when you look at how Iowa performed, gents, when they stepped up in class, outscored 92-0 in 3 games versus AP-ranked teams, Penn State, Michigan, and Tennessee. I mean, this was a team that couldn't throw the forward pass. Every other team in the FBS that won 10 games last year outgained the Hawkeyes by 1,000-plus yards. A new offensive coordinator, though, and Brad, maybe that gives the old gold and black hope that this offense can enter the 21st century. You look at Tim Lester taking over as the OC, was a top 35 nationally in terms of total offense for 4 consecutive seasons when he was honing his craft in Kalamazoo. But, I mean, this is a group that scored 20 offensive touchdowns in 14 games last year. But don't tell Hawkeyes fans, Cade McNamara won't make them forget Brad Banks anytime soon.
Not to beat a dead horse, but let me give you a few numbers on the futility that was the Iowa offense last year. I looked last 15 years of FBS play. There's been 1,904 individual offensive seasons. Only 8 teams averaged less yards per game than Iowa last year. Those 8 teams average wins in a season, 1.5. And Iowa won 10 games. So obviously couldn't generate anything big play-wise. Team stacked the line of scrimmage because they didn't fear the pass whatsoever. I mean, the quarterback play last year, you mentioned McNamara. I mean, it's painful to watch. Starting with McNamara, I mean, looked like he needed a walker or a cane. I mean, it was that bad, particularly in the Western Michigan game last year. But before, they shut his season down, and then Deacon Hill looks like Jared Lorenzen without any passing ability. I mean, the Iowa offense.
That's disrespect to Jared Lorenzen, Brad. At least he showed flashes of being a competent Division I quarterback during his time at Kentucky.
Well, yeah, out of the pocket without getting trampled on by his O-line. You could at least get out of the snap without falling over.
Deacon Hill, I mean, how does he end up on a Big Ten roster? I would question, I mean, how he would end up on an FCS roster, let alone a Big Ten roster. I don't get it. But let's talk instead of rely on the negativity. Let's talk this year. And obviously you got to upgrade off an historically bad offense, starting with returning starters. There's at least experience there with 8 returning starters there. You mentioned Tim Lester. Fired at Western Michigan, was okay, had a winning record. Obviously his biggest mistake was, trying to follow up from PJ Fleck there, and often historically great run there at Western Michigan. Lester, though, when you go back to his Western Michigan days, ran a lot of 11 personnel. Is Iowa going to be set up in a bunch of 3 wide receiver sets? I don't know if that's the case this year. You would hope that he plays to his personnel strengths. I mean, they do have 3 really solid running backs in Williams, Johnson, and Patterson that somehow ran for 1,500 yards, even though the teams are stacked up on the line of scrimmage. So there's some stuff to work with at running back. There's some stuff to work with at tight end, provided Lachey's healthy at tight end. He comes off of injury. They did lose Eric All at tight end, probably their top player. Not saying much on this offense. He got drafted. Let's talk quarterback, though. McNamara, by all intents and purposes, is expected to be healthy. I got to be honest. I have my doubts. Didn't obviously participate fully in spring. And, let's read the tea leaves. If they were 100% confident in McNamara, are they going out and getting an experienced Big Ten quarterback in Brendan Sullivan from Northwestern? Probably not. He seems like a decent insurance policy. Not that he's going to set the world on fire, but, he did complete in his 8 starts, 69% completion rate. To compare that to what Iowa's done at the position the last 10 years, since 2015, no quarterback in Iowa has topped 60% in any single season. So the bar is very low to cross here. Whether McNamara is healthy and plays somewhat up to his capabilities that we saw, back in 2021 at Michigan, we'll see there. Caleb Brown is an interesting guy, a wide receiver, an Ohio State transfer. Obviously, he has some talent there. They just couldn't break in that uber talented Ohio State room. He actually, somebody took a bunch of film from the Iowa spring game. It wasn't televised or nothing, but somebody, kudos to whoever that Iowa fan was, basically clipped up the whole game from the stands. I was able to watch the Iowa spring game, and Caleb Brown was one of the guys that actually flashed to me. So they might have something there at wide receiver to work with. They do have experience on the offensive line. 4 starters back there, 154 career starts. I like their center, Logan Jones, but I will say this. Obviously quarterback play has been abysmal. Play calling left a lot to be desired. If there's a reason why Iowa's offense has taken a downward spiral a little bit, the quality play at the offensive line just isn't there than what it was even 3-4 years ago when they were churning out a bunch of first-round tackles. They don't have a first-round tackle, in my opinion, and that type of talent on the roster right now. So it's an experienced offensive line, but it's not going to be one of their best ones in the last 10 years. So when you add it all up, we're talking about a decent upgrade. They upgraded about 3 points, but it's still, we're still talking a very below-average offense here.
You mentioned the offensive line, Brad. Not coincidence when your strength and conditioning coach gets himself in off-field trouble, and you're right. That's been the building blocks of this Iowa program for years and years, and it hasn't exactly lived up to advanced expectations going in. And I think part of the reason that they were excited potentially getting Caden Proctor back home before he decided to return to Alabama. You mentioned Cade McNamara and some of those numbers after tearing his left ACL in the 5th game last season. Through week 5, McNamara ranked 119th or worse amongst qualifying FBS quarterbacks in completion percentage, yards per pass attempt, and pass efficiency. So don't let any Iowa Hawkeyes fans sell you on him being the great white hype under center in any capacity. It's also an Iowa program that hasn't had an individual wide receiver have more than 400 yards receiving in any of the last 4 seasons. So not exactly a ringing endorsement for what this team is going to do offensively. But Payne, when we look at Iowa and the reason they were able to win 10 games last year, it's all about their defensive mastermind, Phil Parker. It was a defense that had their fewest yards allowed per play in the FBS last season at 4.1, and they were out there on the field for 970 defensive snaps, the 4th most in the FBS. You do have extensive experience returning and a lot of reason to be optimistic that Iowa can pick up where they left off, although they set an awfully lofty standard in a newly revamped Big Ten, and you don't have a luxury of playing those Big Ten West opponents that can't throw the forward pass.
We talk about coordinators a lot and giving them the benefit of the doubt, and I think Phil Parker, who you mentioned, is one of those guys that when it doesn't look as strong on paper, when you think there's a question mark area, it just feels like the sum always ends up being greater than the parts, and rarely, if ever, does the team fall out or the unit fall out. It's just next guy steps up. It's a system, it's development, it's the culture. Reading the tea leaves, Parker loves what he has. Iowa didn't take a single defensive player in the portal. When I look on paper, the position heading in the season that I would have questions about is the defensive line, right? You're replacing Joe Evans, Logan Lee. I don't think that's easy. It's not just on field. If you listen to some of the player quotes this offseason, there's like a massive leadership void those two guys left. And, specific to them being players, Logan Lee was a great edge setter. Joe Evans led Iowa in pressures and sacks. Those two are gone, and internal reports suggest that it's Yaya Black and Ethan Herkert that are ready to fill the void. Herkert steps into that role as an edge setter, over 500 snaps last season, was elite doing it. Yaya Black inside, good against the run, provides some pressure to make himself a little bit of a threat. And then, it's just what's next? And I think some of the strength and conditioning questions that Brad's brought up on the podcast for Iowa the last few seasons have taken a little bit of an effect on the defensive line as well. Last year started very, very slow with pressure and sack numbers. Eventually, Phil Parker figured it out. But they're looking for the next group of guys here. You have Deontay Craig, Aaron Graves, Jeremiah Pittman. They all have to make a leap forward simultaneously. If you look in 2022, Craig had a 15% pressure rate on pass rush snaps. His role expanded last year, that number cut in half. Aaron Graves flashed an ability to get inside pressure last season and was solid against the run. Pittman is a guy up front. Other players talk about making that year 3 leap, but is there a consistent pressure guy that emerges from this group? Linebacker room does have a dynamic duo in Higgins and Jackson. Higgins had a monster season as a full-time starter last year. He's entering year 5. It's kind of a prove-it year where he's got to tell people last year wasn't an anomaly season. Higgins just was an absolute demon. You watch the film, it matches up with the metrics. He was an elite run defender, elite tackler, proved to be good in coverage as well. Nick Jackson transferred to Iowa last season from Virginia. Year 6 for him. He's coming off a career season as well. Elite run defender and tackler, 6% missed tackle rate. Listen to Phil Parker a little bit. That's the guy he loves blitzing. 32% pressure rate on pass rush snaps from the linebacker spot. It was actually more than Abdul, who everyone's talking about from Penn State. I do question it, though, right? As a sports bettor, it's like, what are the odds that both linebackers simultaneously have career years again? And that's kind of how I think about that. Secondary loses Cooper DeJean. That's going to be tough to replace, not just on defense, but we talked about how bad Iowa's offense was. He was the offensive weapon that was returning punts. He was more efficient returning punts than I think Iowa's offense was.
Still thrilled about that fair catch against Minnesota.
It was a good call. It was a good call.
I agree. It was the right call. All the Bet the Board listeners would concur. It was 100% the right call. We
shouldn't even have been in that spot. That should have been an easy cover.
We're in that spot every week betting against Iowa.
That's very true, especially in the House of Horrors.
We want to talk about that game.
The cupboard, to me, is still pretty well stocked in the back half. Sebastian Castro plays the cast position, right? Effectively the slot. He's big enough to help, the linebackers and tackle well enough, but then, is great in coverage. Against the run, 36 stops. Castro, he's quick and fast enough to be fantastic in coverage, only 43% passer rating allowed when targeted. Top-graded defender last season. Iowa has 2 6-year super seniors patrolling in the back with Schultz and Harris. Schultz has been an elite free safety the last 2 seasons. Jamari Harris, a bit of a wild card. He was injured in 2022, dealt with a little bit of the, we'll call it the mental grind of the gambling scandal last season. If he can get back to his 2021 level in terms of coverage, I don't think the loss of Cooper DeJean will be felt nearly as much. You have Xavier Wonkpa, number 1 safety in the 2022 class, went from 90 snaps as a freshman to over 800 last season and was elite. Heads into year 3. I think if he has another big year, you're talking about a late first round, early second round type of guy. Maybe there's a question at corner opposite Harris. Looks like John Nestor's going to get the first crack. TJ Hall and Devin Hilson are in the mix as well. I think what's interesting, and Todd, you said it at the top, and I had it in my notes, if Iowa's offense is improved, and it would be difficult not to be, right? But what does that jump look like? Is it top 90?
Absolutely not.
Okay, so you're thinking top 100-ish?
Yeah, I'm thinking maybe get inside the top 100 and not be rock bottom compared to what they were.
And we know offense equates to winning at a substantially larger rate than defense. So if Iowa's defense gets a little more help this season, they're not going to face as many snaps, right, with a somewhat competent offense. The schedule sets up well both in rest and competition. Only projecting Iowa to face 2 top 40 offenses this season. Iowa avoids Oregon, Penn State, Michigan, and USC. The annual Cy-Hawk game, it's at Kinnick. Only 1 road game in September. 2 weeks to prepare for Ohio State. There's only 5 true road games here. And if you look at the schedule, the toughest travel spot is that short week trek Friday night, right, at UCLA. But a late season bye comes after that. And if you look at the first 9 games ahead of that West Coast trip, Iowa doesn't leave the Midwest for a single game before UCLA. 6 home games, 3 road trips to Minnesota, Ohio, and Michigan. Brad's listening to this. I'm sure he could knock out travel for those 3 stadium tours in a single day if he started in Iowa. So the schedule here, it sets up pretty nicely to the point where I know a lot of people are like, we want to be down on Iowa. At like 7.5 here, like I don't really see a path to being like bullish on wanting to dive into the under.
I mean, they're going to be favored in 11 games. That's how people are betting over 7.5 right now.
The Ohio State game, there's not a certain loss on the schedule.
That's what it feels like. The market's starting to be like, okay, our hatred here for Iowa metrically, makes some sense. But when you're gauging it against a market at basically like 7.7 here. That seems a little nutty based upon this specific season.
Yep.
Well, the one thing I'll ask you, Brad, as we close the book on Iowa, you have to make a 13-point downgrade for the Hawkeyes after losing Torrey Taylor, who was their most valuable player last year.
Well, I'm glad you brought it up. I mean, if there was an MVP, for the offense, it was the punter, right? No question about it. Cooper DeJean returning punts, and then a punter setting up, the defense. Obviously, when the opponent's inside their own 10 consistently, like Taylor was doing, it'll be interesting. Now they're pretty high on the replacement, but I mean, you are going from multiple, 2-3-time All-American, so there's probably a little bit of a drop-off there.
It'll be interesting to see when you look at Iowa early in the season how they benefit or don't benefit from some of the hidden yardage. The amount of times that Taylor pinned opposing offenses inside the 5-yard line and allowed Iowa's defense to pin their ears back will be a much different dynamic if teams are starting at the 10, the 15, or on touchbacks at the 20, so something to keep tabs on. From the Iowa Hawkeyes to the Maryland Terrapins, Mike Locksley's bunch in College Park, and when we look at Maryland, guys, we've seen their win total take substantial under money. 7.5 heavily shaded under about 2 months ago. We're now looking at a 6.5 shaded to the under. We've seen their odds to win the Big Ten drift out from around that 80-1 threshold upwards to the triple digits. This is a Maryland program seeking its 4th straight winning season for the first time since the early 80s. 4th most points per game last year in the conference behind the 3 heavyweights, Penn State, Michigan, and Ohio State. And from a defensive standpoint, it was the fewest points per game allowed as a program since the 2010 season. We look at the schedule. They'll host USC on October 19th and visit Oregon on November 9th. They've never faced either of those opponents in program history, so an interesting wrinkle there in the new look conference. But Payne, when we talk about Maryland over the last couple of years, they have been synonymous with the productivity of little Tua. Talia Tagovailoa no longer there. A quarterback battle all spring. A running back that people are optimistic about in Roman Hemby, and plenty of potential options in the receiver room. But if you can't sort out your quarterback and you have 2 offensive coordinators in Josh Gaddis and Kevin Sumlin that leave a lot to be desired, how do you assess what the Terps can accomplish offensively on the football field this fall?
It's tough. You mentioned the loss of Baby Tua. He's the school's all-time leading passer. And you talk about this competition battle, and Locksley and Gaddis have said all of the right things, how this is a 4-horse race. It feels like, at least initially, it's between Billy Edwards, who helped win the Music City Bowl, and MJ Morse, the former 4-star NC State transfer. You look at these guys and break them down. I don't know if either's a great option, right? Billy Edwards provides some physicality in the ground game, and the passing sample size is small, just over 100 dropbacks the last 2 seasons, but the accuracy is a real issue, 62% adjusted, and most of that is either in mop-up duty and a bowl game Auburn looked very disinterested to be in. And you take it one step further and look at where some of the success that Billy Edwards has comes from. It's everything is he needs a play fake element to help as a passer, quite frankly, right? If MJ Morris is being brought in after Edwards has been in the system multiple years and won the bowl game, it tells us something, right? And so I think all signs point to MJ Morris leading for this job in fall. Let's see kind of how the dust shakes out there. I look at Morris, and he was substantially better in 2022 than he was in 2023, learning a wildly different system at NC State. He appears to be the better passer, although he's not like fantastic, but he also has more upside. Morris also has a little bit different of an ability. You know, his running style isn't as physical, but he can still be explosive with his legs, and I still think they'll use Edwards in short yardage situations. It just feels like it's trending towards Morris winning the job in fall camp. Edwards was just a disaster in the spring game, and they gave MJ Morris the MVP and looked better after 2 months in the system, and he should know the playbook better heading into fall camp. You mentioned the best parts of Maryland's offense. It's pass catchers. Can that actually come to fruition if there's questions at the quarterback position? And that's ultimately the big question here. And Loxley said multiple times this offseason that it could be his best receiver group during his Maryland tenure. You have Caden Prather. He's going to be relied upon as the outside X receiver. Big guy, 6'3", 215. He heads into year 4. You've seen improvement every single season. You know, yards, touchdowns, yards per route run have all increased. You have Ty Felton, veteran guy. Reliable hands, 4 career drops. I think the X factor this season is Shalik Knotts. Staff's raving about him. He was a top 150 player in the 2022 class, high 4-star kid. He has some juice. So when he caught the ball in spring, it just kind of looks different when the ball's in his hands. Offensive line, though, is transitioning, and I think that's, you know, the key indicator before you get to see things and you have professional bettors, you know, pounding the market on some of these futures and things, and you just immediately think, right, all-time leading passer gone, top 3 offensive linemen gone, and you're making that bet before you see things just because you know what that looks like every single season when teams lose that type of caliber of player. All 3 of these guys are on NFL rosters right now. You know, DJ Glaze was the horse, 3rd-round draft pick, 32 career starts, allowed a 2% pressure rate last season. Corey Bullock, signed by the Ravens. Or it is the Ravens know what they do with, know what they're doing when it comes to offensive line. He allowed 1 QB hit last season. You have Gottlieb, who was signed by the Eagles, another good NFL team who knows what offensive line play looks like. He allowed 1 hit last season on 419 pass block snaps. The portal was hit hard to replace those 3. You have Alan Hron comes over from D2 Shorter College. Initially transferred to Penn State, then flipped to Maryland. Hron was, an all-Division II player. I wonder what that transition looks like. I saw it firsthand with Kyle Morlock, who came from Shorter. It was not a smooth transition at Florida State, so there's some question marks there at left tackle. He's battling Fagan and Kalonji for that spot in fall camp. Isaiah Wright transferred in from Buffalo in late May. Is he going to be acclimated to the system quickly enough? Above average pass protector last season at the lower level, struggled to create push on the ground. You have Josh Kaltenberger transferring in from Purdue. Nearly 600 snaps the last 2 seasons. Played those snaps below replacement level. Appears to be a lock start at center. Then you have Alu Ba. Familiar with him. Comes over from Georgia. It was a Georgia-Florida State battle in 2022. Played 13 snaps in 2 seasons for the Dogs. I think he's going to start for Maryland. He's just this massive 6'5", 335-pound road grader. I think he's got a chance to be impactful. Isaiah Bunyan, Kyle Long, those 2 appear to be battling for the left guard spot. Long played 500 snaps last season, wasn't good. Bunyan is a converted defensive lineman, but started at guard in the spring game. So it's just, offensive line scares me a little bit. You mentioned that running back room. It's fine with Hemby, but if he doesn't have much in front of him, creating room for him, that's tough. He was a guy last year, 3.8 yards per rush after first contact. The conversation with him is, can you be more dynamic at the 2nd and 3rd level? He really doesn't have that explosiveness or burst yet. Nolan Ray is a kid the staff is excited about. He seems to have more burst than Hemby. But when a program like Maryland loses its all-time leading passer, 3 starting offensive linemen all in the NFL, there's going to be a dip. And so, even last year, I thought Maryland's offense underachieved. That was Baby Tua's final showing to get to the NFL, and it's just outside the top 50 schedule adjusted offense thanks to Josh Gaddis, and our opinion on Gaddis has long been stated, right? So it's just, to me, it's hard to take Maryland seriously when they're not hiring the best candidates possible, but coaches that fit an agenda. And pro bettors are extremely down on Maryland. It's why this win total has been hammered from 7.5 to like 6.3 right now. And Maryland better come out fast because the schedule's soft early, but there is a non-zero chance the Terps don't win a game from October 19th onward. Last 5 games of the season, Maryland's offense plays defenses that are all projected in our top 25. Iowa and Penn State, in that top 15 range. So it's win early this season, or it's going to get ugly for Maryland.
Yeah, it almost feels like when you look at the Terps' schedule, big swing games for them. Week 3 when they go on the road to Charlottesville against a Virginia team that they should beat, former ACC rivals, and, of course, a measuring stick game for first-year head coach in Bloomington in late September, Kurt Cignetti's Indiana Hoosiers there. But, Brad, when we look at Maryland, Payne laid out the case for the offense taking a step back. Defensively, talked about some of the numbers suggesting that was one of the better stop units that they've had under Mike Loxley's leadership, but they lost some key contributors on this side of the ball as well. Tarheeb Still takes his talents to the NFL, was a 5th-round draft pick. Bo Braid, who led the team in tackles, no longer a member of that stop unit. And Jaquan Shepard, who had a team-high 8 PBUs, won't be out there either. When you look at Maryland defensively, how big a drop down do you see this season, or is it a group that can pick up where they left off a year ago?
Yeah, I think they pick up where they left off for a variety of reasons. They also lost Barham at linebacker, a nice solid transfer that ends up going to Michigan. But there's a lot to work with here, particularly up front on that front 7. Now, maybe I got a little bit misguided because I also saw what Payne saw as far as the spring game. Offensive line's work in progress. What I saw on the defense side of the ball was a defensive line dominate that offensive line in the spring, particularly. You mentioned MJ Morris getting the spring game MVP. Are you kidding me? Jordan Phillips, if you watched the first quarter and a half of that game, was the MVP of that one, dominating on the interior of that offense, on that interior of the defensive line there. You mentioned some of the stats, so before I dive in deeper to this year's team, last year's team was, pretty decent, at least comparatively speaking to the previous Maryland defenses. We're talking about a defense that ranked in the top 15 in yards per play allowed, number 31 in total D, number 40 in scoring D, only allowed 3.4 yards per carry. They only had really one bad performance. That was against Penn State. The Michigan and Ohio State game's a little bit misleading. Michigan got a couple of non-offensive scores, and Ohio State kind of turned it on there in the second half, but didn't have a lot of bad performances, was relatively consistent, even though some of the more advanced stats say it was a pretty average group. We mentioned the 3-4 guys that they lost, but again, everybody else is back. We're talking about a defense that has 8 returning starters, also returns their coordinator for a 3rd year in Brian Williams. When you get to 3rd, 4th year as coordinators in today's day and age of college football, that's a lot more continuity than most. I think why I'm more in that, hey, they're just going to pick up where they left off is, this was surprising, deep diving into just, the talent-wise. You think Loxley, you think offense first and foremost with Maryland. The last 2 recruiting classes for Maryland, they've signed 7 4-star players, all of them on defense the last couple of years. So there is some talent to work with. I mentioned the strength of the defense being that front 7, 5 returning starters, 6 of them seniors. Mentioned Jordan Phillips. I like the Fuller kid from Florida State. I know it didn't work out at Florida State, but that was a very deep defensive line room. Very productive for Maryland last year, even though they were 59th in the country as far as havoc. They're not sacking the quarterback much, but they were pretty decent when it came to stuff in the run. You mentioned Barham leaving for Michigan. They still got 2 very experienced linebackers in Gote and Hippolyte. Played a lot of football, multiple-year starters there. Did lose 3 guys in the secondary, but, again, there's pieces to work with. Dante Trader impressed me. He's 3rd on the team in tackles. Glendon Miller in the back end had 4 picks, including a very important pick 6 in the bowl game for them. And to me, we'll mention this multiple times. Well, if you don't believe me, let's just look at the coaches and what they think of their, the defensive personnel. They only went out and got 1 transfer on defense. That's it. 1 transfer. It was a good one. I'm familiar with him. He's played at my alma mater, Bowling Green cornerback Jalen Husky, all-MAC performer. So that's a nice solid addition there to replace some of that production loss in the secondary. This is, a Maryland team overall. I mean, Loxley surprised me. I didn't think much of him. Obviously, the New Mexico situation was abysmal, a 3-year period there, but they're out their best back-to-back seasons in 20 years. I agree with the market that they'll take a step back this year, but it won't be because of the defense. So I think a lot of the reason the market's down on Maryland has everything to do with the offensive side. I think the defense is just fine.
It's awfully interesting. You look at teams, and we talk about the Big Ten West, and those folks will have a brutal reality based on how the schedule shapes up. You do wonder on some of these teams that have kind of toiled in that middle tier in the Big Ten East if they'll benefit for the years that you don't have to play Penn State, Michigan, and Ohio State year in, year out, and you draw some more manageable opponents. But to your point, Payne, this is a schedule that gets extremely daunting late if Maryland can't make hay early in the campaign. So it'll be interesting to see how the market responds to them and how they're priced in some of those winnable contests. From Maryland to a program that'll look to try and repeat as national champions, the Michigan Wolverines. Their win total opened 9.5. It was heavily shaded to the under, but we're starting to see a lot more 8.5s shaded to the over popping up throughout the market. We've also seen their price to win the conference drift out at the same time from plus 550 out to 7.5 to 1. They became the first Big Ten team to win 15-plus games since the University of Chicago accomplished that feat way back in 1899, coming in off to this season off their 10th national title in program history. They became the first Big Ten school to win the national title since Ohio State did it back in 2014. When we look at Michigan's schedule, the toughest games, aside from the regular season finale against Ohio State, all come at home as Texas, USC, and Oregon all head to Ann Arbor, so something to keep in mind. Michigan also won't play a true road game until October 5th after starting with 5 straight in their own building. Their first road game, well, that'll come against the Washington Huskies in a national championship rematch, although these rosters will look significantly different than what we saw in early January. And Brad, when we look at this team offensively, I mean, they were ultra efficient last year. They could lean into J.J. McCarthy and his decision-making. Blake Corum was their bell cow back. Didn't get that much in the way of production or explosive plays, I should say, from a player like Donovan Edwards, who returns. Some questions in the receiving room, but I think the biggest question that Michigan will have to answer on offense, outside of Coach Harbaugh not being there, is at the quarterback position. Do you feel the quarterback of the future is actually on this roster currently?
Maybe the true freshman, Davis, but he's not going to be, the answer as far as their prospects for 2024. So in one word, no, I don't see it at quarterback. But let's go back to last year before we talk this year. Michigan offensively, statistically, was not a dominant offensive team last year. I mean, weren't in the top 30 in yards per play, number 69 in just basic total offense. That didn't scream, dominant, considering that they had a cakewalk schedule the first 8-9 games of the season. And for all the narrative out there, Michigan just lining up and just destroy teams with their powerful rush attack. Didn't even rank in the top 50 in rushing offense, and number 52 in yards per carry. I think everybody remembers them lining up and running it 30 straight times against Penn State. The reality was that, they struggled to get the efficiency from running back outside of, Corum running in for a bunch of short yardage touchdowns. So we're talking, maybe one of the bigger downgrades as far as an individual unit power rating that, in the entire country. When we're talking about this Michigan offense, I got it down 7 points. Lost 8 players to draft. There's only 1 returning starter for them. I'm not a huge fan of the new offensive coordinator. Kirk Campbell was a play caller at Old Dominion for 1 year. It says 2 years on his resume, but Old Dominion didn't play football in 2020. And obviously was the Michigan quarterbacks coach last year. Little light at this level of college football and a defending national champ. That's a little light on the resume. Obviously, you mentioned J.J. McCarthy gone. Number 1 draft pick, 27-1 as a starter, a great leader. Wasn't fully healthy all of last season. But there's a significant downgrade, to say the least, at quarterback, especially when you pop on the spring game. Alex Orji and Jack Tuttle. Jack Tuttle didn't play in the spring game. He's expected to obviously compete and be in the mix here. Orji's just simply not a threat as a passing quarterback. And I don't know if you can line it up and win a bunch of football games with this Michigan offensive line this year by running it 50 times a game. Just don't see it. So my gut is they will do everything that they can to see if Tuttle can be that guy, because he just gives them a passing threat that they don't have with Orji. Davis Warren is also a guy that's in the mix at quarterback there, but none of the 3 guys we're talking, below average Big Ten type quarterbacks. So not much to work with there. Blake Corum's gone at running back, pretty significant, considering Donovan Edwards, explosive, but hasn't been healthy the last couple of years, and now he has to have that much bigger workload. I just question, is he capable of handling 20-25 carries a game? Last 2 years say no. For a guy that couldn't stay healthy, getting 10-15 carries a game. Mullings is going to have to be their short yardage guy to hammer in between the tackles this year, in my opinion. They lose 3 of their top 4 receivers, all of them drafted. I will say I don't mind the receivers and the tight ends. In fact, I think they could be a little undervalued this year. Morgan and Tyler Morris, to me, aren't going to be that significant of a drop-off from Roman Wilson and Cornelius Johnson. I know both those guys were super productive and were multiple-year starters. They just never – I didn't go into a game that thinking, oh, wow, I'm scared of Roman Wilson and Cornelius Johnson if I'm an opposing defensive coach. So I think they're okay there, and particularly, Frederick Moore is a guy that's super fast. You get him out in the open field, again, flashed big time in the spring game. Colston Loveland at tight end, their only returning starter. It just so happens to be, first or second team All-American type of tight end. So he was a guy that flashed as a true freshman on a very loaded roster. They like the Klein kid as the number 2 option at tight end. They think he could be good. But besides quarterback, my biggest worry would actually be the offensive line. 0 starters back. Last year, they had 3 first-team All-Big Ten type performers. And the guys that they have replacing them, I mean, they look good on when you look at the measurables, 6'7", 315-ish, but not a ton of experience outside of Preeb, the Northwestern transfer. Miles Hinton should be okay at left tackle, but again, a downgrade there. I just think that the unit takes a big step back. And you mentioned the schedule. Yeah, they start off with a bunch of home games, but Texas and USC are a little bit better than East Carolina, Bowling Green, and UNLV. So, yeah, they play a bunch of home games early, but my goodness, we're going to find out. We're not going to have to wait until some early November game against Penn State like we did last year to find out how good Michigan can be. We're going to find out in week 2 against Texas, and then we'll also find out more against USC. So, significant step back on this Michigan offense, in my opinion, this year.
I'm still convinced if Coach Harbaugh was there, he would have found a way to buy out of the Texas game week 2 because it doesn't fit the Michigan DNA to try and build up on non-conference cupcakes and play a glorified preseason schedule. But, Payne, when we look at Michigan defensively, I mean, this was a group that allowed the fewest points per game in the Big Ten since 1997. They held all 15 opponents to fewer than 25 points. They did lose a couple of key contributors to the NFL in Jenkins, Sanderstel, and Colston. But before we get into some of the personnel, the defensive coordinator change. What do you make of that? I know it's a defensive coordinator that you know all too well, being as involved as you are in NFL handicapping on a week-to-week basis.
Yeah, I think that's probably a good place to start, a little more high level than getting into the position groups and players right off the bat. We know Jesse Minter followed Harbaugh to San Diego, so they turned to a man that our NFL audience is a little bit more familiar with in Wink Martindale, and our thoughts are well publicized on Wink, and there's a reason the Ravens finally moved on, and it's that Wink lacked scheme diversity, and Wink had the 99-mile-an-hour fastball. Basically, that was what he did. It was a kamikaze defense with a league high blitz rates year after year, and there was rarely a quality off speed pitch, so to speak. And Wink went to the Giants, and Daboll brought him in because he respected him as a defensive mind for decades, like we all did, right? I mean, this has been a complete 180 career-wise for Wink. But I think the hope was to kind of rehabilitate Wink and get him to think differently about how offense has changed the last 5 years. And Wink was not receptive, and it led to serious infighting and a really messy divorce from the Giants. And kind of where I think we go with this is you look at Michigan's schedule this season. The offenses it faces are like a teeter-totter. At one end of the spectrum, there's a slew of what we'd project to be incompetence, right? Northwestern, Illinois, Minnesota, Michigan State, Indiana. And I think the uber-aggressive style that Wink uses has a real chance to overwhelm those types of offenses and make it look like Michigan's had little to no drop-off defensively. At the other end of the spectrum, there's 4 offenses that we have at least marked as potentially having the chance to finish top 10 if everything goes perfectly, right, with Texas and USC and Oregon and Ohio State. Now, I don't think those offenses all finish top 10, but they have the potential to. Those are the types of offenses that are likely good enough to hit the 99-mile-an-hour fastball they know is coming. And so...
Don't give Quinn Ewers too much credit week 2, by the way.
That's very true. I think people are finally starting to come around on the Quinn Ewers ain't that dude thing, which I like to see.
So Arch Manning week 3 should gobble up those 201 prices on his Heisman numbers that are out there?
We'll get there next week. That secondary for Texas is... Anyways, I think when you look at Wink, the fortunate situation for him is he walks into a ready-made situation, right? I mean, Mason Graham and Kenneth Grant are back. Mason's just so unique, right? I mean, it's 6'3", 320. He's an elite run defender, has the ability to get the quarterback as well. I mean, 12% pressure on pass rush snaps from the interior is a solid number that allows him to play all 3 downs if needed. Grant, another good run defender, 335 pounds, but he gets enough pressure to where he's more than a 2-down tackle if need be. Michigan has Josiah Stewart. I'm shocked last year. I mean, it was mostly because of blowouts, and as Brad mentioned, the offense kind of played keep away. He only played 350 snaps, but the way he set the edge and the way he tackled, it shouldn't be a problem if he's a 500-600 snap guy. The transition from Coastal Carolina was extremely smooth, 16% pressure in on pass rush snaps. Derek Moore was a fringe starter last season. He's going to propel into a more prominent role, and then there's some upperclassmen depth with Rashawn Benny and TJ Guy. This is an elite starting 4, arguably the best in the country. I'm interested to see how the depth pieces shake out because Michigan does lose 3 key cogs from that defensive line and Chris Jenkins and Braden McGregor and Cam Good. That led Michigan to being our number 1 schedule-adjusted defense in the country last season. Linebacker group, I do think, ticks down a touch with Michael Bennett and Junior Colson both getting drafted. Those two had elite seasons simultaneously. Barrett just, if you look at the metrics, didn't have a hole in his game last year. Colson was good against the run and pass, and for a guy playing with 2 broken hands, had less than a 5% missed tackle rate. And I know Sharon Moore's come out and said numerous times that the linebacker group's going to surprise people. Ernest Hausman, who was the 3rd linebacker in the rotation last year, he's going to move into the starter's role. He's a solid player. Michigan hit the portal. We just talked about him, right? Grabbed a top 150 recruit in Jayshon Barham from Maryland, who started as a freshman for the Terps. He's been a plus player back-to-back seasons. Did struggle mightily in coverage last year, though. But past those 2, it's like... So I think you kind of dip in terms of starter and you dip in terms of depth at the linebacker position. Secondary is interesting, right? Josh Wallace ended up being the Wolverines' most efficient corner last season. Didn't allow a single touchdown. 50% of targets were caught. That was it. Keon Sabb played at an elite level in his 300 snaps last year. Former top 100 player, transfers to Alabama. Mike Sandstra was fantastic in the slot. He's gone. Then in spring, you have a starting safety, Rod Moore, tear his ACL. He's out for the season unless Michigan somehow makes the playoffs. So you do have Will Johnson. He's a lockdown corner. I think we've talked about him since he was a true freshman on this preview podcast. He's elite. Allowed a 31 passer rating when being the closest defender in coverage last season. You have Makari Page is back at free safety. Michigan's looking for an elite season there. He was actually better in 2022 than he was during their championship run last year. Michigan found, his running mate when it plucked Wesley Walker away from Louisville. I think something we discussed on the ACC preview because there was that hole at safety. He's a 6-year super senior plus player. The other 2 spots have questions, right? Zeke Berry in the slot. He's a top 50 kid in the 2022 class, so their talent's there. You have Jair Hill, a redshirt 4-star freshman opposite Will Johnson. Not really enough sample size on either of those 2 players, but they are wildly talented. Then you look, Michigan goes and adds lower-level corners, transfers in Amir Hall from Albany, Ricky Johnson from UNLV, so depth was certainly a question. You add Jaden Mangham late as a depth safety piece. He was a 4-star kid from 2022, played over 600 snaps for Sparty last season at a plus level. So to me, the secondary has to stay healthy with unknowns, and then the corner 2 spot and nickel, have some questions, and then maybe there's some depth questions as well. So, unless catastrophic injury luck unfolds, right, this is still a top 12 defense, top 10 defense, top 8 defense, somewhere in that range. Because, a few teams have that trio of Mason Graham and Josiah Stewart and Will Johnson, but I'm not as high on Wink Martindale unless he changes something. There's not as much depth as last year's defense. And I think what we have all kind of, our listeners are hearing here is there's going to be more on the shoulders of the defense because Michigan's offense is dipping down multiple tiers. And while it wasn't the most efficient offense last year down to down, Michigan did a great job of playing keep away and allowing its defense to be fresh. There were so many blowouts where Michigan was able to rotate more defenders and keep them healthy and fresh for that late season run. So, the clear downtick in offensive efficiency that's coming this season means more snaps for Michigan's defense in a year where maybe we're questioning some of the depth. So I do think Michigan's defense drops a relative tick this season. All right, they're not going to fall out of the top 25, but you go from being number 1 to 8, 7, 10, 12, whatever it is. And so I think both sides of the ball take a dip back.
Final question I have for you guys, and I'll open it up to either one of you. What kind of downgrade do we make at the head coaching position as Sharon Moore takes over for Coach Harbaugh?
Oh, it's pretty substantial, even though, people are, what? I mean, Harbaugh, they didn't miss a beat without Harbaugh, last year in a lot of those key games. But I think as time, we mentioned strength coaches. They lost their strength coach, who they thought they would keep. I think it'll become more and more apparent year 2, year 3, just how good Harbaugh was for Michigan.
It's easy to replace a guy for a couple weeks when it's you against the world mentality and all the players are stepping up. But when the program's in your hands and you have to worry about every single facet of it, Sharon Moore is a relative unknown in that, right? We have no idea what his ability is in doing that. That's great. He was a good fill-in when in a championship year when all the players are taking an us against the world mentality and they're stepping up for their head coach. See what it looks like when it's his own show.
That's a great point, and one you want to continue to monitor the trajectory of the program, figure out if that drop-off comes later in the season. Once some of those Coach Harbaugh fingerprints are no longer on a group, that'll have a much more difficult schedule for the first month than they've grown accustomed to. So no doubt Michigan, all eyes on the Wolverines as they'll try and defend the national championship. You can follow our esteemed co-hosts on social media. You can follow Brad on Twitter at BradPower7. You can follow Payne there as well at Payne Insider. I'm, of course, Todd Fuhrman. You can follow me there. Most importantly, for all things Bet the Board related, be sure to follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. And as we go from the heights of college football, I won't quite say it's the depths, but it's a program that's fallen on hard times compared to their lofty standards in the past. And from a historic standpoint, that would be the Nebraska Cornhuskers, who see their win total 7.5. That's heavily juiced about 2 months ago, now trending towards that 7.5 flat range. We've seen modest movement on their odds to win the Big Ten from that mid-60s range into the mid-50s. And this is a program now that has 7 straight losing seasons on their resume. They had just 3 losing seasons in their previous 55 campaigns overall. 5 wins in the first year under head coach Matt Rule, tied for the most wins over the last 7 seasons, but they still have yet to reach a bowl game. Now a drought running on 7 straight campaigns. They've also lost 24 straight games versus AP top 25 opponents, the last victory coming back in 2016 versus Oregon. But you look at Nebraska's schedule, and we've said this last year, we've said it in previous years with Scott Frost, it sets up for them to build a little bit of momentum if they can get a big win against Colorado week 2 and parlay that into some conference success. But Payne, much like we had questions about Michigan and their defensive coordinator, I think there are a bevy of questions that have to be answered for Nebraska and their offensive philosophy, who now, under Marcus Satterfield, who has to share the reins with co-offensive coordinator Glenn Thomas. This was a group that averages 18 points per game and had a nation-leading 31 turnovers as a group, although I'm convinced Jeff Sims accounted for 97% of them, and he's no longer on the roster. In steps talented freshman quarterback Dylan Raiola. Henrik Harburg was a run-first quarterback mentality, but there's a lot of reason, at least coming out of Lincoln, that there's optimism about some of the skill positions and, of course, on the offensive line.
You mentioned Marcus Satterfield, and I think we've been as critical of him than anyone for multiple seasons, and it's kind of now became the cool thing on social media. But you go back, and we were doing these previews, God knows how long, but when he was at South Carolina in 2021, it was like, hey, he didn't really improve the Gamecock offense, and the bar for improvement was really low. And, year 1 at South Carolina finished outside the top 80 in schedule adjusted efficiency. 2022 kind of started the same way despite the massive upgrade at quarterback and going and getting what is now an NFL guy. And Satterfield was finally alerted that he was being fired at the end of that season. Scored 16 total points against Missouri and Florida 3 weeks apart. But it was bizarre because once Satterfield knew he was gone, he opened things up. He was like, fuck it, right? I'm out of here anyways. Let's just go do this thing. And the final 2 games against top 10 teams in Tennessee and Clemson, South Carolina wins both of them. And you're like, where was this? And then Matt Rule hires him last season, and I'm hoping the light came on, right? You learn something from your last stop where you got shit canned. And maybe that aggressiveness that we saw at South Carolina was going to be applied to the new job. Nope. Right? Like Nebraska's offense dipped 30 spots year over year to one of the worst 20 offenses in the country. There was zero imagination. There was nothing but predictability. Nebraska had a bottom 10 early down offense because of those 2 things, and the quarterback play wasn't good enough, which you mentioned, right, to bail Satterfield out in these long down situations that were so common. And even if you're lacking quarterback talent, trust me, like watch some of the guys that get the most out of bad quarterbacks, like Brian Daboll in year 1, right? You can't go into a shell. You still have to be aggressive. The 40 and 50-yard arm punts from your quarterback are better than fumbles in your own backfield and interceptions on 6-yard throws that are short of the sticks on 2nd and 3rd and long. Defenses lived at the line of scrimmage and sent heat and caused a ton of chaos last season because there was no threat of aggressiveness. And if you look, Nebraska allowed opposing defenses to create a 22% havoc rate. It led to gobs of turnovers, 16 picks, 30 fumbles, of which exactly half were lost. Now, I'm coming into this season giving Satterfield the benefit of the doubt. This is the last chance with me. I'm treating him as a blank canvas, and I'm doing that for 2 reasons. Everything I saw in the spring game, everything I've heard from folks internally is that Nebraska's offense has completely changed. RPO spread concept, faster pace, more tempo, more aggression. It's a complete 180 from Nebraska's offense last season. I had no idea. You flip on the spring game, you're like, who's the offensive coordinator here? Because this ain't what I've been seeing. And it's more
Glenn Thomas's fingerprints all over this.
It's very possible, right? And it's more of what we saw the final 2 games from Satterfield at South Carolina when his offense helped upset 2 top 10 teams. The second reason is that combination of Jeff Sims and Chuba Purdy won't be under center. I am very familiar with those 2 gentlemen since both were committed to Florida State at one point. You have a 5-star true freshman in Dylan Raiola, going to be under center. Clearly he is going to, experience some growing pains as a true freshman. But 81% of Nebraska's turnovers last season were directly committed by quarterbacks. That number, even with a true freshman, will diminish because of the talent and scheme change. Nebraska's offensive line should have better injury luck than last season. Ben Scott, the anchor of the line, is back, plus center after transferring in from Arizona State last season. You have Bryce Benhart, the top-graded lineman Nebraska had in 2023. He's back. Going to be playing right tackle. Micah Mazuka has played 1,500 snaps of plus ball back-to-back seasons in the Big 12 and SEC. Teddy is back at left tackle. His snaps have increased every year. He's coming off his best season as a pass protector while returning from injury. So you'd think being healthier this offseason allows him to build on some things from last year and his senior season. I'm interested to see what Nebraska does in the fall at the other guard position. Metrically, there's no way I could start Henry Levitsky. The weapons are interesting. What version of Isaiah Nair is Nebraska getting, right? That the 2021 Wyoming version who averaged 2.9 yards per route run and only had a 6% drop rate, or the guy that was lacking a little bit of confidence after some serious injuries. I actually liked seeing Nair in the spring game without even a sleeve on his knee. It tells me, he's feeling confident. You have Jamal Banks, the 4-star transfer from Wake Forest. He was the Deacon's leading receiver last year. He's sure-handed, not a single drop on 88 targets. Jaden Lloyd, top 10 player in the state of Nebraska in 2023. Big play threat. All 3 of his touchdowns as a freshman went for 56-plus yards. Had another 60-yard explosive TD in the spring game from Raiola. And then it's figuring out the depth, right? Does the light finally come on for Malachi Coleman? Bonner was recruited as a tight end, appears to be more of a big slot. You have Alex Bullock, who has the experience. The freshman from Miami, Ja'Cory Barney, he wowed people in spring, had an explosive TD in the spring game. Running back room is deep, but I'm interested to see who emerges as the alpha there. You have Gabe Irvin, has the talent, struggled with some injuries. He had an ACL injury, a hip injury. The 3 games, though, that he played last season, 3.9 yards per rush after first contact, was very elusive. You have Dante Dowdle, a top 200 player in the 23 class, transfers in from Oregon, had a monster spring game. Emmett Johnson shows some flashes. I am out on the Ramir Johnson thing. We know what he is entering year 6. Hopefully Dowdle and Emmett have more upside, and I'd rather give those 2 guys the carries. But you look at the schedule, Nebraska has to stack wins early. Offense has an opportunity to build confidence with this change that they have. There's not a single top 40 defense we're projecting on Nebraska's schedule the first 5 games. So there is a real chance here for offensive improvement for Satterfield.
Look, this is a team that fan base is craving something to get excited about, and I think we'll get a pretty good litmus test for where the Cornhuskers are offensively week 2 when they take on a Colorado team that, while we question some of the depth, does have some top-line talent. So we'll get a pretty good indication of where Raiola is, assuming he wins the starting job out of camp, and what some of these weapons are going to be able to do in a game of that magnitude. Now, defensively, Brad, we know Tony White loves his 3-3-5 defensive alignment, and we saw this group achieve some pretty lofty expectations a season ago. Finished 11th nationally last year and 5th in the Big Ten. We saw a 9.3 points per game improvement from the 2022 season when they allowed nearly 28 points per contest. When we look at how this team performed, they ranked in the top 10 in the FBS in run defense, opponents' yards per play, and red zone touchdown percentage allowed. Nebraska was always going to try and take on that DNA of its head coach in Matt Rule, and it was about defense, physicality, and a lot of those traits that you like to see from some of the black shirt defenses. I know they have a long way to go, but at least the building blocks are hopefully in place for Nebraska to continue some of the momentum that they started Matt Rule's first season.
Yeah, I think they definitely have the personnel to continue what they did last year, and that was a much improved defense. Last year ranking number 7th in the country in yards per play, 11th in total D, number 13 in scoring D. They allowed 3 yards per carry. Now, I will say they're not exactly facing, a murderer's row of opposing offenses in formally the Big Ten West. But last I checked, Nebraska played in the Big Ten West in 2022, and you mentioned those defensive improvements. Allowed more than 100 yards per game less on average. Allowed nearly 10 points per game less on average than what they did in 2022. So a first year under Tony White was a smashing success, so much so that he was getting a lot of looks at other places, including even for the UCLA head coaching job. They were able to keep him long-term, have him sign an extension on paper. I'm not sure if they continue the defensive success this year, how long he's going to be there in Lincoln. He'll get a head coaching job, but I'm a big fan of Tony White. You mentioned the 3-3-5, Rocky Long disciple. And when you run the 3-3-5, you got to have the personnel to do so, and frankly, Nebraska has those guys up front to run the 3-3-5. It starts with Nash the Polar Bear, that's his nickname, Humpmacher, Ty Robinson, a couple of 300-pounders. Pretty productive, to say the least, up there in the interior of the defensive line last year. They need a little bit more pass rush, in my opinion, to help out the secondary, which I'll get to in a second. But, Butler, 5.5 sacks. Is he that guy this year? Or is it a couple of talented former 4-stars, Uman Milan, Lenhart? They were pretty productive in limited snaps. We're only talking about 250 snaps each of them got last year, but in those snaps, they were productive. If they get a little bit more, can they be those breakout candidates to get some more pass rush? That would help out a secondary that, a couple times in games got exposed, Colorado specifically. Isaac Gifford is back on that back end. He's been here forever. I think Frank Gifford might have called some of his games. He led the team in tackles, and 35 more than the number 2 guy. So, clearly production there. 6.5 tackles for loss, 8 PBUs. So he's there in run support. He's also there on the back end. Tommy Hill, to me, graded out to be one of their better players. 4 picks a year ago. They do lose a couple of guys that have been there 3-4 years, 3-4 year starters in Reimer and Heinrich. But other than that, I can't punch a bunch of holes in this defense. They got the guys up front, provided they stay healthy. I like what I see there. You mentioned the schedule. I want to see how they hold up against Colorado in week 2, because in the second half of that Colorado game, after Sims started the turnover fest, they were struggling in space against Colorado. So I'll be anxious to see how they perform there. But that's the only above average offense they're going to face until late October. So there's an opportunity here for Nebraska to have their best season in nearly a decade. Although I got to mention it. Boy, the back half, a lot of, outside the Ohio State game when there'll be a clear underdog, I'm, projecting a bunch of close games. And we know Nebraska's history, historically bad in close games here the last 5-6 years.
When you look at Nebraska, Brad, and you take a composite snapshot of this team going forward, we know what their win total is. We know how long it's been since they played a postseason game. What would you define yourself as a metric to success? Just getting to the 6-win threshold, or exceeding odds makers' expectations and finishing this year 8-4 under Matt Rule's second time around?
Yeah, it's a good question. No, I think 6-6 would be a little bit of a disappointment, even though it'd be the first time in 7 years they're hitting a bowl game. But boy, the market, there's some people that are loving this team. They're putting faith in a true freshman quarterback to go ahead and go over 7.5 wins. I'm not there. I'm more in that 7-5 range. I would say is an okay season. I think others, at least if I'm reading the tea leaves, are thinking 8-4 is possible. You look at the schedule, they take care of business. It's certainly possible, but I'm not there yet. Trusting a true freshman quarterback and putting a lot of faith in this coordinator on offense, I should say. I can't get to the window on over 7.5. I'll put it that way.
Huskers hoping that Raiola can have the same impact on their offense as Jameis Winston did a decade ago at Florida State under those freshman auspices. When we go from Nebraska to Ohio State, this is a Buckeyes program that hasn't struggled to make the postseason, but it's a group that's looking to get that 800-pound gorilla off their back, and that, of course, is beating Michigan, something that they haven't accomplished in recent seasons. Buckeyes win total 10.5, largely unchanged. However, we have seen their odds shrink to win the conference. Now kind of a 3-2 consensus across the board. There are some slightly better prices, so if you believe in the Scarlet and Gray, do shop around. They did complete their 12th straight season with 2 or fewer losses. Alabama, the only other program with an active streak of 6+ seasons. But for Ohio State, they can say national championship or bust. If they're going to get there, it's going to start with beating the Michigan Wolverines in their regular season finale. The team's first true road test will come in the middle of October when they'll head out on the road for their maiden voyage to Eugene to take on Oregon as a conference rival. Brad, when we look at this Buckeyes team, a lot was made this offseason trying to figure out what direction they would go under center. Will Howard eventually transferred in from Kansas State. Julian Sain waiting in the wings most likely unless Howard struggles. Not quite sure what his workload will look like this year, although there'll be plenty of opportunities for him to get his feet wet, potentially in garbage time early on in the season. Devin Brown underwhelmed to say the least in limited action in the bowl game against Missouri. But when you look at this roster elsewhere, a bevy of talent at the running back position, wide receiver, and even along the offensive line that leads folks to believe that this Ohio State group can go out there and continue to put up crooked numbers on a lot of their conference foes.
I see it. It sounds good, but I still don't think it's where this Buckeye offense was a couple years ago when they had C.J. Stroud and all those wide receivers. But let's start, though, with last year. I mean, across the board, last year's offense was the worst in more than a decade at Ohio State. I mean, 25th in the country in yards per play, 48 in yards per game, 45 in scoring. I mean, that's pathetic considering the amount of talent that Ohio State has on that side of the ball. I mean, you look at their rushing performance was the worst in Columbus in 20 years. Just for that fact alone and who they brought in, I mean, you got to put up an upgrade on the Ohio State offense this year, particularly you get Chip Kelly as a new offensive coordinator. The question is, how big of an upgrade is it? Because I still have some question marks. And I'll start with Chip Kelly. I mean, just because you hire a guy that's been a successful long-term head coach, I don't know if that answers all your problems because, boy, we mentioned this. I mean, has the game passed Chip by just a little bit? He certainly hasn't, his offenses haven't performed like we saw 15 years ago when he broke in through Oregon. He's still a very creative, play caller, X's and O's wise, and maybe it'll be even better that he doesn't have any head coaching responsibility whatsoever. Because I mean, that's why he's here at Ohio State. He just wants to coach, not deal with everything else that's going on with college football these days. So maybe we'll get a more creative Chip Kelly as a coordinator. They bring in Will Howard from Kansas State. Obviously a lot of experience, 33 starts. Is he a really big upgrade over Kyle McCord? I don't think so.
It's a great question.
I don't think so as a thrower. Now, I think he'll certainly be more mobile than McCord, and maybe that's what Kelly wants in a quarterback, and run around a little bit. So from that regard, maybe an upgrade. But again, Will Howard's he's not C.J. Stroud, folks. So I go to the fact of this. I mean, Ohio State's big answer at quarterback this year was probably going to be the backup Kansas State quarterback this year, because, if you read the tea leaves there, Avery Johnson probably was going to be their guy this year. So, I mean, that doesn't scream, pound my fist on the table, national title championship type quarterback from that position. Devin Brown, certainly, I don't think is the answer. And Julian saying, yeah, talent, but true freshman. I got to be honest with you, watch the spring game. He's not a big fellow. I'll put it that way. He's not Cam Newton out there. I also worry that Kalen DeBoer really kind of passed on him. Really didn't there wasn't any shed tears for him. I mean, obviously he signed with Alabama and then transferred within a month or so. And the fact that a guy like DeBoer, didn't cry, have any crocodile tears tells me that maybe saying's not that great either. You look at running back. I mean, this is why you're most optimistic about Ohio State's offense this year. You got maybe if they're both healthy, maybe the best 1-2 punch in recent college football history with Henderson and Judkins. And maybe you got to go back to Reggie Bush and Lendale White from USC, almost 20 years ago. The two of them already have more than 5,000 career rushing yards between the two. And obviously, when you got two guys like that, you can be fresh legs in and out of the lineup. They did suffer a couple of big losses. Marvin Harrison, the top wide receiver in college football last year. I thought maybe the most underrated player on Ohio State's offense, or maybe their entire team last year, was Cade Stover at tight end. I don't see Cade Stover type talent at tight end to replace him. They brought in an Ohio transfer, okay player, and the rest of the guys they already had on the roster, I just don't see it there at tight end. Wide receiver, I'm a little bit more optimistic. They're not going to replace Marvin Harrison with just one guy, but boy, with 3-4 guys, they're still in decent shape there. Emeka Egbuka is back. They signed the 5-star number 1 overall player, what people are calling a generational type talent at wide receiver in Jeremiah Smith. Flashed all spring. If he had a little bit better quarterback play, probably would have flashed in the spring game. The balls weren't necessarily put in great positions. I'll say that watching it. Carnell Tate's a guy that I really like that I think will emerge this year at wide receiver. Another question I have, even though they got a lot of experience, 4 starters back on the offensive line. Donovan Jackson's probably their best guy. But, man, is that a top 5 offensive line in college football? I certainly didn't see it last year. I mean, in multiple games they were dominated. They bring in a center, Seth McLaughlin from Alabama. Okay, he's got experience, but was a starter at Alabama, but famously, had snapping issues in multiple games last year. So we'll see if he has that corrected. I gotta say, big picture, I'm kind of conflicted with Ryan Day, and just one play away from winning the national title against Georgia a couple years ago. But last year, when you just look at pure power ratings and the trend line of your program, his best team was his first team in 2019. His worst team was last year's team. In fact, 2019 I would favor probably by at least 10 points over 2023. So to me, the trend line's not going well. I know they're going all in this year, but man, it could. Do they win at Oregon? And if they don't win at Oregon, what's the media narrative around this team? He seems like he's a little bit on edge at times. I mean, go watch the post game Notre Dame press conference. He's just that can work both ways. I will say maybe one of the more positive things Ohio State has going for him this year, of the 10 teams we are deep diving today, the strength of schedule, they have the weakest strength of schedule of those 10 teams. Besides at Oregon and at Penn State, I mean, this team is going to be a significant favorite in the remaining 10 games, including, they're already out to a 10-point favorite against Michigan in the finale.
They got their Michigan non-conference portion of the schedule to kick things off against a bunch of lightweights, to say the least, and an opportunity to put up some crooked numbers and build some momentum there. But I think the point that you made, Brad, about Ryan Day feeling like he's on a little bit of the hot seat, look, the locals are getting restless. I mean, losing to Michigan, not competing for national championships, that's what this program is judged by. And if they don't get the opportunity to win the conference this year and a potential bye into the new look 12-team college football playoff, it's not going to end well. You wonder if reuniting with his mentor Chip Kelly on the offensive side will be good for Ryan Day, or it could potentially create some problems. Now, Payne, on the defensive side of the ball, Jim Knowles has done an outstanding job molding the talent, getting the most out of what he needs from this stop unit. Group allowed 11.2 points per game last season. On paper, expectations are they could be better this year. But when you go through this group, there is a ton of experience at every level for Alabama, and the rich truly get richer by bringing in Caleb Downs from Alabama to help solidify the safety position. But you brought up an interesting point talking about some of the big names that we'll see on the Buckeyes defense that we're familiar with, but some major questions that they've been able to stick around in Columbus for as long as they have.
Yeah, I kind of want to go back to what Brad said. And it was really interesting because he made mention of Ohio State's team that gave Georgia a run a few seasons ago. And he said this year's version would be, did you say 10 points difference in those two teams?
No, it's his first team back in 2019.
Okay. And I think that's the interesting conversation that we've actually been having, overarching, big picture, the last couple of years. When we look at these top teams, we're like, yeah, well, they might be power rated, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but like, who's the elite team here? And we kind of been pushing that narrative for multiple seasons now. Even last year, if you went to our Georgia preview and we saw what unfolded, like that wasn't an elite team. Elite teams, when they have their B- game, are going to get past that version of Alabama, and they just couldn't. And so I think if you're listening to this as an Ohio State fan or a Big Ten fan, our conversation is relative to Ohio State being power rated the number 2 team, being all in this season, it being championship or bust. And so it might come off a little negative, but that's how we're having this conversation. It's not is Ohio State going to be good this year? Right, that's evident. The conversation we're having is at a national championship level. Now, you mentioned, the defense, Todd. For me, it's more about Jim Knowles than the players. Jim Knowles is one of our favorite defensive minds at the college level over the last, decade, and he's improved Ohio State's defense in a major way. If you think about when he got there, Ohio State was a top 20-ish defense, right? The year before Knowles arrived. It was a top 3 defense last season. And obviously the talent is the most Knowles has ever had to work with. But I truly think the improvement is more Knowles than the talent. And don't get me wrong, like Ohio State has some dudes. But to your kind of leading question there, I think the NFL market is going to be lower on the players that Ohio State has defensively, relative to college football pundits believing they're elite. Like that's my mindset here. And again, it's championship or bust. That's the expectation. I think that's what it has to be for Ohio State, right? Nick Saban retired. Your kryptonite, Jim Harbaugh, has moved on to the NFL. The collective has spent massive bucks. I'm just interested to see what this looks like because it's odd. I'm hearing internally, despite the fantastic defensive season last year, that Jim Knowles and Ryan Day are having serious discussions still about what they want to be from an aggression standpoint before heading into fall camp and implementing things. Last year, Ohio State's defense was great in virtually every single facet. They were more physical at the point of attack and stood up against the run better than they did in 2022 when we all kind of challenged their manhood in these Michigan games. The secondary turned to a top 15 level in EPA last year. It was a great situational defense. They surrendered 2.7 points per trip when opponents reached their green zone. But you look at the aggression numbers, Jim Knowles basically sat back. Blitz rate was 26% against FBS teams. Far more vanilla with assignments and coverages than all those overachieving Oklahoma State defenses the last few years when he had veteran talent. And Ohio State couldn't get to the quarterback last year. They were 10th in the Big Ten in sacks. And I think this is where maybe Ohio State folks and fans get a little bit upset, but like everything to me is relative to a national championship. If Jack Sawyer and JT played at an elite level, like we all envisioned them when they were like the number 1 and number 2 defensive players in that 2021 class, they would have been 3 and done, right? They're top 10, 12, 15 draft picks. The Buckeyes collective wouldn't have been able to retain them. I do like Jack Sawyer, and he made a massive leap last year. Pressures, sacks, missed tackle rates, they all improved. He's very versatile. Ohio State fans that double as Bengal fans probably see how Knowles uses Sawyer and kind of meshes at times with how Lou Anarumo uses Sam Hubbard. But I want Jack Sawyer just to be this downhill beast getting after the quarterback, right? I just want him going forward. And even last year, Sawyer had a 12% pressure rate on pass rush snaps. JT is a fine player opposite Sawyer. I think if you injected scouts with true serum, they'd tell you JT would be a much better fit as an edge in a 3-4 scheme and not the 4-3 that Knowles runs. Just a 10% pressure rate on pass rush snaps. Only hit the quarterback. If you can imagine a guy that's talked about as much as JT, he only hit the quarterback 4 times all last season. He's a good player. He just hasn't been the elite college player that fans perceive him to be. That needs to change in year 4, or Ohio State will not win a title. You have Tyleik Williams, comes back for year 4, damn good player inside, can stop the run, get after the quarterback. Neither at an elite level, though. Ty Hamilton comes back for year 5, solid player, but like who's the bona fide, unblockable force that applies pressure all game, that just wrecks a game? The depth guys along the front are interesting. High star ratings, which guys step up? Kenyatta Jackson, top 100 kid in 2022, less than 200 snaps his first 2 seasons. Needs to make the year 3 leap. Same can be said about Hero Kanu, high 4-star kid, 106 snaps in 2 seasons. Caden McDonald, 200 snap guy. Can he be that type of player? There's a ton of talented depth. Just the depth isn't proven, and we're heading into year 3s for a lot of these guys. Caden Curry, same story. Like, who emerges as that depth piece? Linebacker loses both starters and Tommy Eichenberg and Steel Chambers. Both probably a touch overrated for my money, but there's questions at linebacker, so much so that Sonny Styles is moving from safety to linebacker. Cody Simon appears to be the alpha in that room, 5th-year guy. To me, when I look at the numbers, metrically, he's been better the last 2 seasons than Eichenberg, who is not there. C.J. Hicks, top 10 player from the 2022 class. He's penciled in at will linebacker. He's played 75 snaps in 2 seasons. Little undersized. He's a good blitzer. You have Arvell Reese, could be in the mix as well. There's talent in the room, but only one proven commodity in Cody Simon. I really like the secondary. All of the horses are back except Josh Proctor. Then you go and add the highest paid safety to ever play college football in Caleb Downs, right? And God forbid, right? We talk about like maybe what Ryan Day's lacking a little bit is confidence. Like there's literally internal conversations of Caleb Downs getting running back snaps. Like why would you ever do that? It's just a little bizarre. We know what Downs was. He was a do-it-all true freshman for Nick Saban. Ohio State's lead corners are both back with Denzel Burke and Davison Igbenison.
Say that again 10 times real fast.
Igbenison. Yeah, there you go. If you look at Burke, had a nice season, right? 67 passer rating when he was the closest man in coverage. Davison allowed 50% of targets to be caught and was a fantastic tackling corner. You have Ransom returning for his 5th season. Smart plus player at safety. Jordan Hancock enters year 4 in that nickel role. Made a big leap forward last season. Played 600 snaps, about 4 times the amount his first 2 seasons combined. Solid coverage guy, 62 passer rating allowed when he was the closest man in coverage. Ohio State should have another top 5 defense. Plenty good to win a title. I just think it's more Knowles than the players, and the perceived horses need to play like early day 1 guys, especially in the 2 games that Brad mentioned, because the schedule's a joke. Ohio State plays 9 offenses we're projecting outside the top 70. Michigan's offense going to be way down as well. So it's basically at Oregon, Penn State are the 2 tests for Ohio State's defense. Those are the 2 games where we'll find out, right? If the star ratings turn into elite difference makers, those are the 2 games that Ryan Day hasn't been able to win, and now's the time. I think the one thing that I will say, I completely agree with the sentiment that Will Howard isn't the most talented passer that's ever walked into Ohio State. He's got some concerns with his arms. What I think is interesting about Will Howard, and maybe why I'm not as down as a lot of people who are fading Ohio State this year, what's the one thing that Ryan Day hasn't been able to do? It's like get over the hump and win. And Will Howard was able to get over the hump and win in the Big 12, going against teams that spent like there was no tomorrow, right? You're playing the Texases and the Oklahomas, and it's like Kansas State was able to exceed expectations because Will Howard just understood how to win, and that's kind of something Ohio State hasn't had in this Ryan Day tenure right now.
It's wild to think about, but you guys are exactly right. There'll be Ohio State fans who listen to that full breakdown and go, I can't believe these guys are so down. We're not comparing Ohio State's season and what they can accomplish to the Minnesotas of the world in the Big Ten. If Ohio State doesn't go 11-1, have a chance to win the Big Ten and make a deep run of the college football playoff, the folks in Columbus will be the first to tell you that this season isn't defined as a success by any stretch of the imagination, any more than this next program we're about to break down would define their season as successful without a conference title, even if it is their first foray into Big Ten country. That, of course, being the Oregon Ducks, who see their win total at 10.5, largely unchanged for the most part over the last couple of months. Odds to win the Big Ten sit right around that 2-1 threshold, plus or minus, depending on where you shop. And this is a program will have its most difficult stretch, 2 road trips in 3 weeks across the country to play at Michigan and at Wisconsin in November. We already talked about the big home date early on in the campaign, where they'll welcome Ohio State into Autzen Stadium. And when we look at this Oregon team, look, Dan Lanning has done an outstanding job really beefing up this roster, trying to address some of the positions of need. And he did so, Payne, in bringing in a transfer quarterback in Dylan Gabriel, who will start for what feels like his 23rd season on a college campus, looking to break all sorts of records. But he is the consummate pro and veteran. If he can stay healthy, he can have the same impact on this offense, if not more, than what Bo Nix did last year under Will Stein's tutelage. When we begin to look at the Oregon Ducks, are there questions or concerns about this team offensively, or is this one of the top flight units in the entire country?
I'm sure you guys have seen this story, but I started looking into it, and then all of a sudden, like 3 days later, I was like, oh my God, this is wild. But Phil Knight turned 86 in February. Guy wants a championship like blood, and there was this recent report that surfaced that Dan Lanning has been granted unlimited resources, that Phil Knight is all in. And to me,
give him the black card, baby. Jerry Jones hasn't worked for him, but maybe it'll work for Phil Knight.
It's different at the college level. And I think when you just look at the roster, when you look at how this offseason's gone, like, it's been pretty evident, right? Dan Lanning wants a ready-made quarterback to compete for a title now. No problem, right? You want to take a flyer and a former 5-star that he can let marinate in the QB room for a year? Like, no problem. Wants the best ready-made corners in both, portal and JUCO ranks? Like, there you go, right? And so even like the high school level, right? You think about this, like, Oregon's winning bidding wars against Ohio State, Texas, and USC for both high school and portal receivers. And then they go and add, 2 top 10 defensive linemen in the portal. Dylan Gabriel, you mentioned, is one of those, no problem transfer portal signings. I think he fits Will Stein's offense very well, so the transition is going to be seamless. Gabriel gets the ball out quick like Bo Nix, but I think even with Troy Franklin gone, who's the burner downfield, I think we see Oregon's ADOT increase this season. Gabriel is a little bit more willing to push the ball downfield. Now, he's going to take the short stuff, but you look at Bo Nix, 67% of his passes were 9 yards or shorter. More than 28% of Nick's passes last season were behind the line of scrimmage. So if you're looking at raw data, Nick's adjusted accuracy was better than Dylan Gabriel's last year. But if you look at depth adjusted accuracy, Dylan Gabriel was far superior to Bo Nix last season. And I think we could see a world where Gabriel runs more than Nix did in 2023 because the staff has more confidence in what's behind QB1 this season than last. But if you remember, like 2022 ended with Bo Nix dinged up, banged up. From a staff perspective, Gabriel's one and done. So, for them, preservation for 2025 really isn't a thing for Dylan Gabriel. And so I could see more running. So I do envision a little bit more downfield passing, a little bit more running from the quarterback. The weapons Gabriel has to work with are ridiculous. I think Will Stein came out and said, best receiver room he's ever been around. Evan Stewart was the big get from A&M. Let's see if it can all come together for him in year 3, playing in a modern offense, we'll call it. Was not having that at A&M. Tez Johnson, elite slot receiver. The move from Troy to Oregon last year didn't impact his performance. 3.5 yards per route run a season ago. I fully expect the Gabriel to Tez RPO 8-yard in slant to be spammed this season. You watch the spring game, it was like the play was on repeat. Trayshawn Holden and Gary Bryant Jr. are solid veteran guys. Terrence Ferguson, a fun weapon at tight end. And then there's upside talent with 5-star Jerian Dickey returning from a high school injury. You have McClellan, who Oregon beat out Ohio State for. He could contribute as a freshman. Very nice back shoulder grab in the spring game. Kyler Casper. Interesting to me, right? He flashes every time I see him play. He just looks like a matchup nightmare. Offensive line does lose its 2 best pass blockers from last season, and right guard Stephen Jones and the anchor in Jackson Powers-Johnson. There were far too many wild snaps in spring, and you saw it in the spring game as well, so Dan Lanning hopes to get that cleaned up. You do have 3 returners, and Cornelius at right tackle, 5th-year guy, handled the transition from Rhode Island to the P5 level very well last season. 1 quarterback hit on 541 pass block snaps, although Bo Nix will make your linemen look like elite pass blockers. The ball comes out so quick. Marcus Harper is a solid guard, better pass protector. Josh Connerly Jr., the number 1 lineman in the 2022 class, full-time starter last season, handled things well. The staff thinks it's going to be a big year 3 bump for him. You have Iapani, played 400 snaps as a true freshman last season, was versatile, right center, right guard, left guard, just didn't matter. He's penciled in at center. Matthew Bedford, a 6th-year super senior, transfers in from Indiana. On paper, Oregon has a better pass blocking group than run blocking. Fortunately for them, I'm enamored with Jordan James. He is just an absolute beast. You could see it every time he touches the ball. Then you look at the metrics. They match up. 4 yards per rush after first contact last season. 11% of his runs went for 15-plus yards, so he's got burst as well. I think Jordan James becomes a household name this fall if he also works on self-preservation. I mean, I'm watching the spring game. The man is like searching out contact. He's 5'10", 205, and I'm just holding my breath every time I see he touch the ball. Hard runner for his size. I think the lone question mark, if you had to pick one, right? Obviously, Dylan Gabriel goes down, question mark at backup quarterback. But
you're not buying Dante Moore hype, baby? He's ready to step in and sling it all over the yard.
Kid.
Yeah, he's not bad. I think if I'm just looking at like one question mark, like who emerges as the number 2 running back? Last season, there was no drop-off from Bucky Irving to Jordan James. This year, it feels like there could be from James to number 2. And again, the way like Jordan James was running the spring game, is that guy going to last a season? Noah Whittington is working his way back from injury. Jay Harris, Jaden Lamar, who emerges as that clear number 2, or is it become, back up by committee? The schedule's interesting. Sure, Boise State will be good relative to what they've been and the Mountain West Conference this season. They're not at Oregon's level. The Beavers and UCLA are down. Michigan State isn't ready. Ohio State, really the first true test, and it's in Autzen. Ducks travel across the country to Michigan and Wisconsin in a 3-week span. That could be a little tricky, but you've heard our thoughts on Michigan. They're going to be a little bit down. I'm not completely sold on the new Wisconsin regime, and so I think Oregon's positioned extremely well here. Everyone I talk to that I respect, Oregon's either power rated 2 or 3. They're all in, right? It's another season where you read some press clippings from the Oregon folks, and it's like, a really good season would be making the playoff and, winning a game or 2. To me, the way, Phil Knight spent this offseason, like this is also very much close to a Ohio State championship or bust type team.
It's got the offensive capabilities. To your point, there are some depth questions that'll have to get answered. And can Dylan Gabriel finally get over the hump? We've seen what he's capable of doing when he's able to stay healthy in his own right. Has dealt with a history of concussions at multiple stops. You can hope that he finishes his college career at least in one piece and is able to start all 12 games for the Ducks. Defensively, Brad, when we look at what Oregon's going to put on the field, a lot of expectations for a very talented defensive line group. And Coach Lanning and company, along with his coaching staff, have worked tirelessly to build a roster of athletes that are bigger, faster, and flat out stronger, capable of competing in the Big Ten on a week-in, week-out basis. When you look at the stop unit for Oregon, we saw them struggle to slow down the passing attack in the Pac-12 championship last year against Washington. Didn't take anything away from the game against Liberty. Is this group ready to step up and play a little bit more big boy football on a week-in, week-out basis in 2024?
I'm kind of flat on the power rating, which is saying something because I didn't think they were overly talented defense last year, but still ranked in the top 20 in yards per play, facing a lot of obviously explosive offenses in the Pac-12. They're number 9 in the country in scoring defense. I was surprised to see that in conference play. I know they struggle a little bit against the pass, but everybody is. When you look at the quality of opposing quarterbacks that they're facing on a week-in and week-out basis, allowed 89 rushing yards per game in conference play last year. So not too bad, although I will say that the overall sentiment, and I concurred with this smart gentleman, was after the Washington game, where is after this person watched it, where's all the elite talent on this defense? Didn't see it, this person. Hopefully he's listening right now. 4 guys drafted, none of the first 3 rounds of the draft. And, the NFL draft kind of concurred with that there wasn't a lot of elite guys on this defense a year ago. With that being said, the top 3 guys graded are all gone and departing. Tosh Lupoy's back as year 3 as a DC. They got Chris Hampton in year 2. He basically coaches the back end, being a co-DC. The defensive line's a question mark. Certainly impressed me a little bit in the spring game, despite losing 4 of their top 5 interior defensive linemen. To me, Jordan Birch at defensive end needs to take this next step. 5-star type talent, needs to play like an All-American this year. They certainly have a lot of other blue chippers waiting in the wings. Uiagalele's, the brother, former 5-star player. Is he a guy that emerges at defensive end? The interior of the defensive line, it has been the talk of the spring as far as do they have enough guys or don't they? The guy that I liked, at least watching the spring game, the Caldwell kid from Houston, a 325-pounder, he might have been the most impressive guy up front. But they weren't enough impressed. They want more quality depth. They have the NIL war chest from Nike, so they go out and get a guy like Derek Harmon from Michigan State. If you pay attention to anything like that, this guy was as much coveted as any player post-spring in the portal. We're talking, guys like
7 figures.
Yeah, schools like USC, LSU, Oklahoma. He's up there as one of the highest paid defensive linemen in all of college football this year. They went out, Oregon won that battle and got him. So they have 2 pretty high quality now interior defensive linemen, courtesy of the transfer portal. Guys that they do have coming back that have been with the team at linebacker, Jeffrey Bassa, Justin Jacobs, pretty solid, provided they're healthy. Devin Jackson, another linebacker, was the most improved player in the spring. So there's obviously some pieces to work with there. Secondary, mentioned it struggled in some of their high, when they faced high quality opposing offenses last year, particularly Washington. So what do? They go out and get a bunch of transfers. Jabbar Muhammad from Washington, one of the top cornerbacks in the transfer portal. Cam Alexander was one of the top cornerbacks at the group of 5 level from UTSA. They get him. They also bring in a solid starter at safety in Kobe Savage from Kansas State. Tysheem Johnson from last year at Oregon was the 3rd leading tackler. He was a transfer from Ole Miss previously. I guess what I'm getting at, like the personnel, they brought in any questions that they had, obviously spent the money, brought him in transfer. We're entering year 3 under Dan Lanning. And I think obviously it's been successful so far, but now the expectations, like you mentioned it, Todd, are raised where it's, we're getting to the point where it's close to being national title or bust, even in the first year of the Big Ten. And the thing that I start questioning is this was a program that had 5 straight years of signing the best class in the Pac-12 to close out that conference. This year, best recruiting class, not Ohio State, Oregon, best recruiting class in the Big Ten. Why are you having to bring in so many transfers on a year in and year out basis? I know you want to fill out your roster and you're trying to win a national title, but the Georgias, the Ohio States of the world are not having to bring in 6-7 transfers to fill it out. Where is the development? I know why there wasn't development there for many years. Guy by the name of Mario Cristobal was coaching them. I need to start seeing some development from the high school recruiting now. It's year 3 and heading into next year, year 4 from Dan Lanning, because I got to start to question it because, your first 2 years, you're a favorite, all 3 matchups against Washington, and you go 0-for against Kalen DeBoer. In these high-profile games, which Oregon's going to be playing in them against the Buckeyes, and they'll be in the playoffs, in my opinion, Dan Lanning is still improvement mode for me.
Brad, when you look at a team like Oregon going from the Pac-12 into the Big Ten grind, I know they check a lot of the boxes on paper when you look at that roster from top to bottom, but do you have any concerns about them making a jump up in class?
Is it really a jump up in class? Pac-12 was good last year, really good as a conference. And, outside the Buckeye game, I know Michigan's down this year. That was probably, at least on paper, going to be their toughest road game.
We had Washington power rated higher than last year than it is this year.
At Wisconsin could be a little tricky if the weather's not great, but my goodness, I could make a case that last year's Pac-12 schedule for Oregon was more daunting than this year's Big Ten schedule. I mean, the Buckeye game, and they get the Buckeye game at home, and I have a little bit of a slight disagreement with the market. The market has, in some places, and I guess there's some, disagreement sentiment even in the market. Some places have Oregon favored, some places have Ohio State favored in that game. I have Oregon favored in that game, so this is a team that should be favored, and at minimum 11, if not all 12 of their games.
Should be an interesting program to watch. No doubt the path is there for this team to get to the college football playoff and have a chance to win the Big Ten Conference in their maiden voyage through that particular league. We can say all the good things we want about Oregon and what it'll be like for them as they adjust to life in the Big Ten. Penn State may be the beneficiary of the fact that the Big Ten decided to break down the divisions, and they no longer have to go through Ohio State and Michigan every year to represent the Eastern Division in the Big Ten Championship. And when we look at Penn State, their win total 9.5, heavily shaded to the over. Odds to win the league have shortened a bit, but nothing really substantial. Pretty much a consensus across the board, right around 5-1. And when we look at Penn State, since the college football playoff began in 2014, Penn State has consistently been ranked 5 through 12 in the final college football playoff poll, the most times 6 of any FBS teams. They have 0 playoff appearances. That expected to change this season, or it no doubt will be defined as a disappointment in Happy Valley. When we look at Penn State from a schedule standpoint, the season opener on paper, much tougher than the casual fan may lead you to believe going into Morgantown to take on West Virginia. They won't play Michigan in the regular season for the first time since 2012. And when you look at some of their road dates, interesting dynamics in play there for this Penn State Nittany Lions team. And Brad, when we begin to break down what we expect from Penn State offensively, we know they underwhelmed for stretches last year. Drew Allar's returns in his first campaign, anything but underwhelming would be a little bit of unfair praise, in my opinion, heaped in his general direction. They improved their pass catching capabilities. We look at the tandem of backs. They check the boxes there. But maybe the biggest upgrade this team made was at the offensive coordinator spot, going out and getting one of the bigger names to try and revitalize a group that looked stagnant for stretches last season. Yeah,
that name being Andy Kotelnicki. And obviously, general college football fan probably, who? What? Andy Kotelnicki, never heard of him. How can he be so great? Well, coached the last 10-plus years with a brilliant mind who's worked wonders at each of his stops. Lance Leopold, you might have heard of him, was with Leopold at, Wisconsin, Whitewater, Buffalo, and Kansas. And, boy, if you watched any Kansas games the last couple of years, just a very variety, I would say. As much personnel groupings as anybody in college football, the use of motions as much as anybody in college football. You have to prepare for just about anything. You might see option one play. You might see 5 wide receiver sets the very next play. So I think just from a creative play calling aspects, X and O's, significant upgrade getting Kotelnicki. Very good hire for James Franklin. We'll see if is he completely unleashed, and can he call similar to how he called even with a backup quarterback for a majority of last season in Kansas? We'll see. One thing I do know is when you compare, how Penn State performed offensively, again, compared to what Kansas did offensively, obviously a lot more big plays. Penn State last year only had 19 plays of 30 or more yards. Kansas, 39. Somehow, I don't know how Penn State averaged 36 points per game last year when you're number 75 in the country in yards per play, you're number 55 in yards per game. Your rushing attack took a major step back. You had no downfield passing attack. So, that kind of stat boggled my mind that Penn State, at least from a scoring aspect, was so efficient. Allar, was okay when you look at basic, 25 touchdowns, 2 interceptions, set the FBS record, opening a career with 311 pass attempts without an interception. But again, wasn't taking any chances whatsoever. We're talking, his favorite pass was a screen pass or anything just 5 yards down the field. With the Penn State type of offense that they have, averaging only 6 yards per attempt last year. Pass attempt, not yards per play, including rushing. We're talking pass attempt, 6.7. Kansas averaged 10 yards per pass. So, yeah, you would hope that improves there. But the reality was when Drew had to step up in competition, I talked about some of his efficiency and was okay in some aspects against Michigan, Ohio State, and Ole Miss, the 3 biggest high leverage games of the season. completed less than 46% of his passes. And again, I just got done telling you that he wasn't throwing it down the field 30, 40 yards consistently. And when you complete less than 46% and you're throwing it short, that is not good. Maybe that's why they decided to give Pribula a lot more snaps late in the year, gives him more of a run threat. And I'm wondering with Kotelnicki and his ability to be creative offensively, I'm guessing they're going to have, Pribula get some snaps this year, even in some high leverage games, not just when Penn State's up 3 touchdowns. The disappointing aspect besides the inability to create big plays last year from Penn State's offense was, Katron Allen, Nicholas Singleton, outstanding. You couldn't ask for anything better as far as true freshman seasons. Kind of had a little bit of a sophomore slump. I mean, Singleton went from 6.8 yards per carry to 4.4. But if they just get back to what they were as true freshmen, I mean, you might be talking about the second best running back duo in the country, behind Ohio State's running backs. I mean, even in a disappointing season a year ago where they didn't have a downfield vertical passing attack to open up the rushing lanes, they still ran for 1,600 yards. So Allen and Singleton being back for their junior season's positive. The question, one of the biggest questions as far as the offense goes is probably at wide receiver. Their top guy, Lambert Smith, transferred out. They get Julian Fleming from Ohio State, a good, solid guy, but obviously wasn't one of the top 3-4 guys, in my opinion, at Ohio State, and was going to get passed up by some of the younger guys this year. Harrison Wallace and Caden Saunders need to be those guys. They've certainly flashed in the spring game, despite a very windy spring game. Tyler Warren is an all Big Ten type of player at tight end. So there's some pieces there, but they're just not going to wow you. I mean, this isn't an Ohio State wide receiver unit that we saw 3-4 years ago at Penn State this year. So, but we'll see there. The thing that's actually the biggest question that I have for Penn State on offense this year is up front. Anytime you lose 3 NFL draft picks, your top guy being your star left tackle who goes in the first round, I got some question marks, to say the least, up front. And it's not like they've recruited exceptionally well. They had to go in the portal, bring in a couple guys, including Rucci from Wisconsin, former 5-star player. So even though I like Kotelnicki quite a bit, there's right now, for a team that has a lot of expectations, I have right now more questions than answers as far as Penn State's offense goes.
When you look at this team defensively, Payne, do you have a lot of the same questions with Tom Allen taking over for a group that allowed the fewest yards and yards per play last season while also accumulating the most sacks? Top 3 in the FBS in opponents' points per game, opponent yards per game, and opponent yards per play, as you mentioned. But a couple of players drafted to the next level, and it puts the onus on the remaining cast to be able to fill some of those potentially large voids.
I think if you're buying Penn State this year, you're buying its coordinators. And Brad mentioned the OC from Kansas, Kotelnicki, who we've raved about for a couple years. We also really like Tom Allen as a well-respected defensive mind. He develops well. His Indiana defense has performed better than the talent, especially in 2019 and 2020. And, talent is probably not going to be as large of a barrier at Penn State. And honestly, if you look, I know we're not really overly high on James Franklin relative to other people, but he has created a very nice baseline of defensive success no matter the coordinator. Tom Allen's Penn State's 3rd defensive coordinator in 4 seasons. And if you look since 2019, Penn State's defense has finished 15th or better in schedule-adjusted efficiency. So you're expecting Penn State to live in that area without a ton of variance, despite some intricate changes this year. Tom Allen's said he's going to run the 4-3 scheme like Manny Diaz, but I would expect less aggression. We know what Manny Diaz likes to do with his defensive linemen and have them play incessantly in the backfield. And there's talks of this new position called the Lion. Sounds extravagant. It's not. Most defenses play with a hybrid slot corner safety that tackles well enough that you can remove your 3rd linebacker from the field, right? And you look at, and I know we talked a little bit about this off air, and you introduced at the top, like, to me, Penn State's defense last year didn't get talked about at a record-breaking achievement national level, and it probably should have. There was very few weaknesses. It's the reason Manny Diaz got another lifeline as becoming a head coach. The D-line had a 26% stuff rate. Front 7 created havoc at a 20% rate. Elite early down defense. Situationally, offenses couldn't do a thing on passing downs. They couldn't convert for points when reaching Penn State's green zone. It was very good in just about every single aspect. Now, I look at Tom Allen. He's going to lose some of his horses from last season's team. Chop Robinson and Adisa Isaac are gone. Chop was a pure speed rusher and disruptor. 18% pressure rate on pass rush snaps. Isaac, 16%. But I will say those two only played 700 snaps combined last season. So there was lots of rotating. A lot of these guys that are going to be contributing this year were depth pieces last year, but got significant snaps in some of those blowouts. Abdul Carter is all the rave. He's making the transition from outside linebacker to end. Seemed natural after some weight gains. Needs to be a breakout year. I know he was fantastic at linebacker, showed some clear pass rush ability, 24% pressure rate on pass rush snaps over 2 seasons, 12 sacks, but it's different, being blitzed off the edge from a linebacker position than it would be if your hand's in the dirt. I also want to see if Abdul can set the edge. He struggled with tackling last season, 28% missed tackle rate. So is he going to be able to hold up on early downs, setting the edge and making tackles to where, he can get after the quarterback on 2nd and 3rd and long? Danny Dennis Sutton played more snaps than either Chop or Isaac last year. He enters year 3. I really like him. He's just a behemoth. He can set the edge. Also had an 18% pass rush win rate, shirt up his tackling. The depth at edge is interesting from the standpoint of, there's experience with Zariah Fisher and Amin Vanover. Both are entering year 5. Neither has played more than 500 career snaps in 4 seasons, so is the upside there. And then there's young guys with more potential but little experience like a Jamal Lyons. Inside, Devon Ellis returns for year 6. Again, we have these conversations, right? Like if you're returning for year 6, how good are you? He's a good run stopper that doesn't offer anything in the pressure department. Had 1 good season with enough sample size to matter. I actually like Zane Durant's growth. 3-star kid that's developed, nearly doubled his snaps to over 300 last season and was a damn good run defender, has to clean up his tackling. I think the theme of the tackle position is experience, right? Depth pieces and Hakeem Beamon and Keziah Izzard both returning for their 5th playing seasons. I'm actually higher on Penn State's linebacker group than the national narrative. I don't think Curtis Jacobs will be missed all that much. He was slightly above an average player for 4 seasons. Kobe King was substantially better. He's the alpha of the group now. Tony Rojas and DeLuca played very efficiently last season. Both were fantastic in coverage. I think DeLuca cleans up the tackling a little bit. He'll be fine. Rojas was a fringe top 100 kid in the 23 class. He played 120-plus snaps as a true freshman. The upside and talent are absolutely there for Rojas to pop in a big way this season. Secondary loses 3, right? Kalen King, Daquan Hardy, and Johnny Dixon. Corner group's going to sort itself out in fall camp, right? Cam Miller and Elliott Washington started the bowl game. Okay there. Both are 4-star top 175 kids. You have Zion Tracy, wasn't as highly regarded out of high school, but saw nearly 150 snaps as a true freshman last year. A.J. Harris, another young kid, number 2 corner in the 23 class, transfers in from Georgia. Jalen Kimber is the veteran of the group. He transfers in after spending 4 seasons in the SEC between Georgia and Florida. Let's see who takes the outside corner jobs in fall camp. It sounds like if a game were to be played today, it's Cam Miller and A.J. Harris. Jalen Reed looks poised to start at that new Lion position. I really love the safety, Kevin Winston. He seems to be the leader in the back. 500 snaps of elite ball last season, only allowed 50% of targets to be caught, and was an absolute monster in run support. If you can believe it, from the safety position, 46 tackles, 21 stops. Sounds nice. 0% missed tackle rate for Winston. Zakee Wheatley stepping into a full-time starter role at free safety. Needs to be better in coverage. 85% of career targets have been caught against him. Last season, Wheatley allowed a 152 passer rating when he was the closest defender in coverage. On paper, he is a weakness. For me, just overarching here, unless Abdul plays to the hype level, I can see Penn State's D-line taking a step back. I'm a touch lower than the national narrative on Penn State's defensive line. I don't believe this is the 2nd best defensive line in the country like others. Now, is it top 10? Sure. And it might not sound like much, but going from a historically good top 3, 4, 5 defense last season to a top 15 defense, is far greater metrically than it sounds out loud, even if defense isn't as valuable as offense. Right out of the box, Penn State gets test on the road at West Virginia, and offense we're probably a little bit higher on than market, a team that we're a little bit higher on than market. USC, Ohio State, a solid Washington offense are on the schedule. There are some tests for Penn State's defense. I think, again, the delta is very small. The variance isn't large. I expect Penn State to live in that same range defensively as they have the last 5 seasons, but maybe just a little bit on the lesser end of that spectrum.
It's such an interesting program, one that I know has long suffered from an inferiority complex, hailing in the Big Ten East, playing behind Ohio State and Michigan. Somewhere along the way, Coach Franklin has to break through, and maybe the 12-team college football playoff gives them the opportunity to try and get their seat at the table or contend for a conference title. But no doubt, if Penn State is on the outside looking into the playoff this year, it will no doubt be defined as a disappointment by those lofty standards in Happy Valley. From Penn State, we head back out west to break down the USC Trojans. And when we look at USC, their win total 7.5 has remained largely unchanged over the last couple of months. Odds to win the league have shortened a touch from the mid-20s now into that 18 to 20 range, depending on where you shop. And when we look at USC, back-to-back winning seasons for a program for the first time since the 2016-2017 campaigns, which is saying something for a team that had national title aspirations seemingly every year under Pete Carroll in the early 2000s. Won a bowl game for the first time since 2016, snapping a 3-game bowl losing streak. It was their first bowl win since they knocked off Penn State 52-49 in the 2016 Rose Bowl. They did finish the season unranked in the final AP poll, top 12 in the AP poll in each of Riley's last 6 seasons, though, as an FBS head coach. And when we begin to look at USC from a schedule standpoint, they'll play 3 road games across multiple time zones in a 5-week span. So there's no doubt the new look Big Ten will challenge them a little bit in terms of some of the frequent flyer miles that they'll log. They had a mass exodus of players leave for the transfer portal. 29 outgoing transfers, the most in program history. Not always a great look. But Payne, the biggest question I think Lincoln Riley has to answer this season for a USC team that started last season hot against inferior competition and really cratered down the stretch is who will be his man under center when we see USC start to play meaningful football. We saw Miller Moss look outstanding against Louisville in the bowl game. Jaden Maiava, who exceeded people's preconceived notions during his only season at UNLV, entered the fold as well. So when you look at USC from an offensive standpoint, what kind of questions or known commodities do you have pertaining to what Lincoln Riley will be able to accomplish this year in the Coliseum?
This is going to be really interesting. It feels like a big year for Lincoln Riley, obviously. To me, you look at Miller Moss, and is he as talented as Caleb Williams? Like, obviously not. Few are. But I also get the vibe that if you think Miller Moss is only a game manager, that could be the wrong viewpoint. Moss has plenty of arm talent, right? He's also willing to play within Lincoln Riley's system. Far less backyard football, something we talked about last year with Caleb Williams. Now, the sample size and comparison data are small, but Miller Moss got rid of the ball 0.61 seconds quicker on average than Caleb Williams last season, and that was enough to see a massive delta in their pressure numbers. Caleb Williams pressured on more than 33% of his dropbacks last year. Miller Moss, 16%. All of the, improvisation that we see in Caleb Williams' highlight tape is fun. And occasionally, or maybe even routinely, it results in a miracle play that works, and we're like, oh my God. But when Caleb Williams was under pressure last year, he had a 9% turnover-worthy throw rate. USC's offense was actually far worse than it appeared because of pure luck. Caleb Williams, 16 turnover-worthy throws when he was pressured. Only 4 ended up getting picked off. Again, small sample size, but Miller Moss, 1.5% turnover-worthy throw rate on all dropbacks. I also loved seeing Lincoln Riley try and aid Miller Moss with play action, something we talk about good coordinators doing all the time. But the best part was Moss was substantially better without the play fake element. So a lot of this data suggests that Miller Moss is going to play within the system and get the ball to elite playmakers and get the ball out on time. And I don't know if the drop-off is going to be as substantial as people would think after losing, the number 1 pick in the draft at a position that's the most valuable in football. The other positive I think Miller Moss has in his favor this season, the weapons around him I think are better than what Caleb had last season. Receiver room has ready-made elite talent. Zachariah Branch, number 1 receiver in the 23 class. If you noticed last year, all the hubbub early hit the freshman wall. He actually joined the track and field team this year, so I'm hearing Branch is in the best shape of his life, so he can have some longevity to the season. Jacoby Lane at 6'4", wicked wingspan, looks like a breakout candidate as a sophomore. Everyone in the country wanted Deuce Robinson last year. He's 6'6", versatile to where he can line up as like a big X or a pass-catching tight end. Mekhi Lemon broke out in the bowl game. The staff loves him. And then the room has veteran depth behind the young studs if it's needed, right? You have Kyron Hudson, Kyle Ford, Jay Fair. Offensive line should be improved year over year. Lincoln Riley believes it's the best group he's had up front at USC. Last season, kind of like a hodgepodge of transfers and holdovers from the prior regime. There's a lot of shuffling around early in the season. So Lincoln Riley, one thing he did, he came out, he named his starting center, named the left side of his starting line, heading into spring to help build chemistry with those guys. So you have Jonah Monheim. He's moving from left tackle to center. He's the best lineman on the team. Elijah Page, the four-star freshman who chose USC over Notre Dame, played about 80 snaps last season, gave up one pressure. Lincoln Riley came out after the bowl game and claimed that Page played the best of any tackle in a singular game against Louisville in that bowl game. Pergnon heads into year 3, 1,400 snaps under his belt at left guard. The right side of the line is a little shakier, right? There's a 3-man battle at right guard between Noah, Amos, and Gino. Mason Murphy at right tackle. His good is really good. His bad is not worthy of scholarship. So if Mason Murphy can kind of unlock some consistency in year 3, I think Lincoln Riley gets proven right, and this will be the best offensive line he's had, in his tenure at USC. Woody Marks at running back looks like a nice scheme fit to Riley's system. He's got some serious burst. He can catch the ball. He's reliable in terms of fumbles. You got the 2 4-star backs who joined last year in Quentin Joyner and Amarion Peterson. Quentin Joyner, to me, is the X factor in this backfield. If he reaches his upside, he's the better between the tackles runner than Marks. It would provide a really nice 1-2 punch. Marks, while efficient, hasn't really proven to be a true bell cow in his 4 years at Mississippi State. I think in any other year, I would be pounding the table that USC's offense won't have nearly the dip people think with Caleb Williams gone. The schedule scares the shit out of me, right? And the Trojans' offense has no favors this season. Right now, we're projecting only 2 defenses on the schedule to finish outside our top 50, Utah State and Washington. 8 defenses on USC's schedule we're projecting inside our top 25. Miller Moss and Lincoln Riley have an absolute gauntlet of a defensive schedule to navigate. USC is kind of one of those handful of teams you hear us talk about annually where they'll be better than the record indicates. I'm intrigued to see what this looks like, but boy, the schedule is just absolutely daunting. It's kind of sad to see because I think Miller Moss and Riley would be able to do some things this year just based upon what I see here in this offensive room, and it's sad the schedule is this tough.
From a family standpoint, Brad, we may have to recruit you to come root against Brian Kelly in that season opener, so my better half can leave Allegiant Stadium on that first Sunday of the season with a smile on her face as USC will be a 6-point underdog against LSU, at least the way the market looks now. But, Payne talked a little bit about the offense and how things will look different without Caleb Williams, but defensively, this group has nowhere to go but up. The biggest move they made this offseason was changing defensive coordinators. Pour one out for Bet the Board fan favorite Alex Grinch, who underwhelmed the say the least during his time in Southern California. D'Anton Lynn changes addresses, moving from Westwood to USC. They bring in former North Dakota State head coach Matt Entz to come work as a positions coach and add Eric Henderson from the NFL. Before we get into the expectations for what we think USC can accomplish this year, this was a group that allowed the most points per game at 34.4 in a season in program history, the 13th most in the FBS last season, allowed 34-plus points in 8 straight games. It was the longest streak since becoming an FBS program in 1922. They allowed 40-plus points in 3 straight games, the longest streak in program history, and it was not a pretty state of affairs, to say the least. Brad, when you look at USC, the upgrades they've made on their coaching staff and their overall talent level, reason to believe that it can't get closer to rock bottom than what we saw from the 2023 edition of the supposed stop unit for the Men of Troy.
Yeah, I mean, obviously clear upgrade for the defense. Just the question is how much of an upgrade? You mentioned the coaching staff. staff. It's kind of an all-star defensive coaching staff. I mean, I know Lynn only had one year as a defensive coordinator, but I mean, UCLA's D went from 87th to 11th in just 1 year under his coordinating abilities. And obviously, Lynn confused a lot, confused Lincoln Riley's offense and Caleb Williams at the end of last season, to say the least. You mentioned Henderson coming from the LA Rams as a co-DC, coaching the defensive line. Matt Entz, a very successful FCS head coach at North Dakota State with 2 FCS national championships. He's just coaching linebackers. Doug Belk was a very hot name as a defensive coordinator just a couple of years ago. Now his Houston defense didn't perform that well last year, but I mean, he's just coaching the secondary. A guy that was thought to get a big-time defensive coordinator job just a year ago is just coaching your secondary. So, I mean, that's as good of a group as you could possibly hire in one offseason. So kudos for Lincoln Riley for being able to do that. And then you look at the personnel, and you got to have an upgrade there. Why? I mean, just for the fact that they brought in 7 transfers who were starters, not at some FCS school, not at Bowling Green, but they were 7 starters at power programs a year ago, including, Kamari Ramsey at safety, cornerback John Humphrey, starters in Lynn's defense a year ago. So coaching and personnel upgrade. But to get into the particulars, I still have some concerns. Number one, I know it wasn't a great defense by any stretch of the imagination. You mentioned it was the worst defense in the history of USC football last year. But a couple of their top guys who did flash on a consistent down-in and down-out basis. Solomon Byrd led the team in tackles for loss. Kalen Bullock at safety, 2 of their better defenders, both got drafted. So they'll have to replace some guys there. You talk up front, and this is a little bit of my concern here. Best interior defensive lineman is Bear Alexander. Big Ten coach anonymously said, I think this was the Lindy's magazine, said he's a hell of a player when he wants to be. I couldn't agree more. I mean, there's times where Bear Alexander looks like a top 5 defensive tackle in all of college football, and then there's plays where he's not so much. I could say the same thing for Anthony Lucas, who's flashed at certain points in his career, whether it be at Texas A&M or USC, but can he get down in and down out consistent production? I do like Nate Clifton up front, a 3-year starter at Vanderbilt, a guy that doesn't have the upside of an Anthony Lucas or a Bear Alexander, but maybe he gives them some more consistency up front. Jamil Muhammad, a guy that's pretty productive, 6.5 sacks at edge, he returns. But my concern up front is this. Let's take Bear Alexander out of the equation, who's 313 pounds. You look at the 4 guys up front. I'm going to do the 2 deep here. The remaining 7 players in that 2 deep besides Bear Alexander. This is their weights: 275, 289, 256, 247, 284, 285, 256. You know what I didn't say? I didn't say 300 pounds. And when you're playing a schedule that outside of Florida is the most difficult in the country, and you're playing a lot more power teams this year, the Wisconsins, the Nebraskas, and whatnot of the world, a lot more physicality, and not to mention LSU and Notre Dame non-conference. Can that defensive line hold up? I don't know if they can, so that's a big question mark there. Linebacker, Mason Cow's back after leading the team in tackles. You bring in the Arnold kid from Morgan State who led the Beavers in tackles for them a year ago. They brought in a ton of transfers in the secondary. In fact, 10 of them if you count transfers and freshmen, so they obviously thought they had a big-time need there. I mentioned the 2 kids from UCLA. They also bring in a starting safety from Oregon State and Akili Arnold. The Carlos Nicholson from Mississippi State I thought was one of the better players in the spring game. So they certainly have experience in the back end. We'll see if they can all mesh. Generally speaking, yeah, you got a big upgrade. But the problem is LSU, at Michigan, Wisconsin. And that's just before September is done. You got Penn State. You got a much improved Nebraska offense, in my opinion. I think you got a physical Rutgers team that people aren't giving enough credit for. And then your endings, obviously UCLA and Notre Dame. I mean, boy, the guys got to stay healthy because I still don't see the quality depth, behind the starters. And my goodness, I think this year's team's better, but this is like Payne mentioned, could be a top 20 team in a power rating and go 7-5 with the schedule.
It's such an interesting dynamic that both you guys lay out. When we talk about wins and losses, not necessarily reflecting the team's overall capabilities. USC, no doubt, when you go through their schedule week in, week out, fits into that particular bucket. Schedule not nearly as difficult as Florida on the surface, but the opportunity for a team to finish 7-5 and, to your point, Brad, still be a top 20 team in terms of the overall power ratings, a side that you'll want to look at on a week in, week out basis to see how the market responds, whether they overreact or underreact to wins and losses on the scoreboard instead of what we're seeing in terms of overall talent development. You can follow Brad and Payne on social media. Follow Brad on Twitter at BradPower7. You can follow Payne there as well at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Fuhrman. Follow me there. And most importantly, as always, follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. 2 schools left to go, guys, in terms of deep dives, and both of them begin with the letter W. We'll start with last year's national championship runner-up, the Washington Huskies, whose win total was 7.5, shaded to the under 2 months ago. That number has moved down to 6.5 flat, taking considerable under support. Their odds have also lengthened to win the conference during Jedd Fisch's first season, upwards of 80-1, if not higher. They'll, unfortunately, for the Huskies, have to make 4 trips to the Midwest or East Coast in their first Big Ten campaign, so they will log plenty of miles. They don't get any back-to-back home games, but also have their only 2-game road trip separated by a bye week, where they'll go at Iowa and at Indiana. Jedd Fisch, Brad, comes over from Arizona, but the offense that we saw come up just short against Michigan in the national championship going to look very different with 0 returning starters at Husky Stadium in Jedd Fisch's first season in Seattle.
Yeah, until this transfer portal era, you never saw a 0 when it came to returning experience on offense or defense. But, obviously lost a ton of guys starting off as far as the NFL draft goes. How about 7 guys drafted from the offense alone? 5 in the first 2 rounds. So a ton of high-level talent coming off this offense. And then anybody that was supposed to come back ended up transferring out. So obviously dead last, not only 0 returning starters, but you look and dive deeper as far as, well, maybe some of their backups are coming back. Well, actually, not too many of them are coming back either, because they're dead last in returning production at 26%. New offense coordinator, Brennan Carroll. Sounds familiar? Yes, he is the son of Pete Carroll. Offense coordinator in Arizona the last 3 years, comes over, obviously, with Jedd Fisch. I will say, obviously, you lose a guy like Michael Penix, you got big-time concerns, and there's going to be a downgrade at the position. But, Will Rogers is a pretty solid option, trying to replace a guy like Michael Penix when a guy's got 40 career starts in the SEC and threw for more than 12,000 yards and 94 passing touchdowns in his career. Typically it would be as big of a drop-off as I could give any team at one position group. But, Will Rogers is experienced and obviously wasn't a good fit for Mississippi State's offense last year. That's why the production trailed off. Obviously, he's not in an air raid system here, but I think certainly Washington's offensive play calling will play more to his strengths than what we saw at Mississippi State last year. So that was a good pickup for them. And pickup for Kalen DeBoer, who wanted Will Rogers, and Jedd Fisch keeping him to stay on and not transferring out again. So big recruiting job there for Jedd Fisch. I got another guy that I think is going to play at quarterback, and I think they'll have a package for. That's 4-star true freshman Damon Williams. Originally impressed me in the U.S. Army All-American game. Electric athlete. They were giving him plenty of snaps in the spring game. I think they have a package for him, and he plays 100-plus snaps this year at quarterback. Dylan Johnson ran for nearly 1,200 yards, 16 touchdowns, is gone. But, again, a solid option for them. Bringing in Jonah Coleman from Arizona, had nearly 1,000 yards last year. I like another true freshman. I think, Jedd Fisch is doing a good job. He's got an eye for talent because this Adam Muhammad kid, running back is a position that you don't need to be a senior to play. You can come in as a freshman and get some and play quality snaps. I think Adam Muhammad can be that guy at running back. Big question marks. Now we're getting to maybe it sounds like Brad's pretty high on Washington or a little bit more than expected. Now we get to the problems. Wide receiver position. Obviously, probably the best wide receiver corps in the entire country. Lost everybody. I'm talking their top 7-8 guys, all gone at wide receiver and obviously tight end. Denzel Boston's a guy they're really high on. Extremely high on. You watch the spring game, they literally had this quote and mentioned it multiple times. They expect Denzel Boston to be a 100-catch, 1,400-yard, 15-touchdown type of guy this year. Denzel Boston. If you play fantasy, I don't. keep that name in your back pocket because he played like he was capable of doing that in the spring game. Jeremiah Hunter, who led Cal in receiving the last 2 years, again, another nice portal addition, but my goodness, they certainly do not have the depth that they had at wide receiver or tight end like they did a year ago. And then my biggest concern, maybe of any team that we preview, whether it's this conference or any of the Power 4 conferences, 0 starters back on this offensive line that won the Joe Moore Award as the nation's best offensive line last year. And it's not unlike all these other positions that I've been talking about. Oh, they got a nice option here. They brought in this guy and that guy. I don't see it on the offensive line. Of the guys they brought in, only 2 career starts at the Power 4 level. Did not see it in the spring game. A lot of the expected contributors weren't even with them during the spring, joining the team in the summer. That's not a good recipe. You need continuity on the offensive line. You'd like to see them at least go through a spring when you got 0 returning starters. So their offensive line I downgraded more than any other position group besides quarterback of any team in the country. So we got a big down arrow on Washington's offense, to say the least, this year.
You know, you mentioned an NFL legacy of sorts on the offensive coordinator side and Brennan Carroll. We have one on the defensive side as well for Jed Fish and the Washington Huskies. Steve Belichick comes over from the NFL ranks of the New England Patriots to take over as the DC. Now, Payne, the defensive continuity doesn't look nearly as depleted as what the offense will be faced with this year. There are some key contributors from last year's group being retained, but at the same time, I mean, this was a Washington defense that didn't have to go out there and win games on their own. They just had to be average or slightly above, play to the situation, and allow the offense to go out there and hum. Bigger expectations on this group this season, especially while they try and figure out the offensive identity with so many new pieces.
Brad mentioned Carroll. You mentioned Stephen Belichick. It's a wild name to talk about on a college football podcast, but Do
you think the two of them debate the merits of the run, not run in the Patriots-Seahawks Super Bowl at any time in the coaching room?
They apparently did have multiple lunches together to see if they could coexist, which was pretty funny doing some reading. But Jed Fish executed his plan. He came out and was like, hey, he wanted a blue bloods appeal with famous football names. And if you follow Jed Fish, spent some time with Belichick together in 2020 on New England staff. And, you know, Stephen Belichick's interesting because you think of him like, you know, daddy's boy, but he's been calling the Patriots defense since 2019. And you think about those Patriots teams, like very injured, not much help from the offense in recent years, and Belichick's led back-to-back Patriot defenses that finished top 10 in schedule-adjusted efficiency. He's said all of the right things about adapting scheme to player strengths. He wants to be a multiple defense, but understands it can't be NFL complex. And then before ever calling a defensive play, Belichick goes out, wins a recruiting battle against Florida State for the #1 player in Washington, a 4-star linebacker in Rainey Salee. So it's been a good start to the Belichick tenure in Washington. On the field this season, a lot of new faces, lots of questions. I think things will change from now until the end of fall camp. Defensive line for me, you know, nah. I mean, you look at this, it's like Zach Durfee. He's rumored to be Washington's horse. The only thing we've seen from Durfee is YouTube highlights from Sioux Falls, where he was like an all-conference first-team 2022 guy. Didn't play in the regular season last year due to transfer rules. Played 5 snaps in the postseason against Texas, injured his elbow, missed most of spring with that injury. Isaiah Ward follows Jed Fish from Arizona. 3-star kid, played 500 snaps in 2 seasons. 12.5% pressure rate on pass rush snaps, struggled to set the edge and tackle. Javon Parker decided to stay at Washington. He's going to play defensive tackle. He's a low 3-star recruit from 2022. He's played less than 300 snaps in 2 seasons. Sebastian Valdez transfers in from Montana State. I am a little surprised by 24/7 giving him a 4-star transfer portal rating. Solid, really, really good FCS level player. But it wasn't like ridiculous production at any stretch. He was a good run defender, struggled to tackle consistently, 18% missed tackle rate last 2 seasons. Sack numbers look good on the surface with 15 in the last 2 seasons. It was accomplished on an 8% pressure rate on pass rush snaps. So I'm kind of interested to see how Valdez transitions to the Big Ten. Russell Davis transfers in from Arizona. Good depth piece. You have Jacob Bandis, holdover guy, 6th-year super senior, 743 career snaps of below replacement level ball. You have Voy Tafia, another holdover, enters year 4, 3 seasons of below replacement level production. Bryce Butler, the 3-star JUCO kid. You have Jacob Lane, 3-star sophomore that played 100 snaps as a freshman. I don't see a ton of elite players or great proven depth along Washington's defensive line. Carson Bruner returns at middle linebacker, struggled athletically against Oregon and Texas, but had a really nice season overall, especially in coverage. You have Alfonso Tupatola, is what he is. 6th-year super senior, replacement level his last 1,100 linebacker snaps. Jordan Shaw transfers in. He's going to play the Husky position, hybrid nickel safety role, right? 130 snaps as a freshman at Indiana. I do like a few players in Washington's secondary, but their production obviously is going to have a correlation to front 7 play. So you have Prysock coming over, 4-star corner from Arizona, heading into year 3. Great pick in the spring game against Will Rogers. I like Cam Fab. He's back for year 5. Really nice season last year. Solid in coverage. Good tackler from the safety position. Elijah Jackson played above replacement level in his first year as a full-time starter last year. Did give up 7 touchdowns. I expect some positive regression there. Michael Easton, 350 snap guy last season, replacement level. There's just not a lot of dudes when I look at this Washington defense right now. But what I will say, maybe it's the saving grace, is that the Patriots defenses, especially the last few seasons, aside from guys like Christian Barmore and Christian Gonzalez, and maybe include Matthew Judon in that conversation, weren't loaded with elite talent. It was guys that were smart, knew where to be, knew their role, played within the system. So it's possible you're looking at the type of defense that's going to be greater than the sum of its parts. Unfortunately for Washington, there isn't much time to get acclimated to new schemes and teammates and coaches. Washington has to stack wins early because the schedule is tougher late, and there's so many unfamiliar environments and travel situations. You look from September 27th to November 9th, Washington takes 4 trips across the country in 41 days, 3 to Eastern time zones, 1 to the Midwest. And so you mentioned at the top, right? You can see why the Huskies win total was buried from 7.5 down to 6.5 flat, and there were some even willing to take that second number.
And they're going to have their hands full as early as week 3. I mean, you get 2 layups out of the gates with a group of 5 team and an FCS opponent, and then there's no doubt Washington State would love to try and get their pound of flesh from Big Brother. Credit to them as well as Oregon for retaining the rivalries, at least for this season and a couple of years going forward, with some of their traditional rivals that we haven't seen across the landscape. But when you make a case there, Payne, laying out all the questions that they have to answer defensively, you can understand why other programs across the country weren't eager to poach some of that underwhelming talent, giving some of the metrics. So it'll be on Steve Belichick to get the most of this group.
That Mario plucked from Washington, and then that was in spring, and all of a sudden, like he's doubling down at that position in the last portal cycle. So, going to be interesting to see for Washington's defense.
From the Washington Huskies, gents, we can go back to the Wisconsin Badgers and see how things project in Madtown this upcoming season. The win total for Luke Fickell's team sits at 6.5. It's taken a touch of over money over the last couple of months. We have seen their odds to win the conference shorten from long shot territory, still very much there, but from the mid-80s into the mid-60s. Wisconsin finished their second straight 7-6 campaign, one fewer than 8 games in back-to-back years for the first time since 1994-95. Finished unranked in the final AP poll in each of the last 4 seasons, despite being ranked in the preseason AP poll all 4 years. It's the second longest streak by any team since the preseason poll began in 1950. Brad's beloved Notre Dame Fighting Irish accomplished that for 5 straight seasons from 1981 to 1985. We'll get a great indication of where the Badgers... We'll get a great indication of where the Badgers are when they'll play host to Alabama early on in the non-conference portion of the schedule. But Luke Fickell tried to do what he could to shake up the coaching staff a little bit and bring in some fresh blood. Where he did make a change, though, Payne, was with offensive coordinator Phil Longo in a group that struggled for an identity in the first season, trying to go away from that power run game that we've grown accustomed to from a long lineage of Wisconsin head coaches. But a familiar name slated to take over under center, although if you believe the reports, it's still a little bit more of a battle between Tyler Van Dyke and Braden Locke for QB1 in Camp Randall week 1.
Yeah, I mean, year 2 of the massive offensive shift to Longo's kind of outdated version of air raid for a program that's located in an area where athletes don't grow on trees relative to the South, which is why virtually the entire 2 deep is made up of transfers.
Weather ain't so great there either for meaningful football games in November. Something to keep in mind.
This is. I don't think this is going to be what it's cracked up to be. Tyler Van Dyke is one of those transfers, and he's a kid that we've had a better pulse on than just about anybody. If you remember heading into that 2022 season when virtually every publication and talking head was slotting TVD in his QB3 behind Bryce Young and CJ Stroud, we were emphatically told everyone to stop the nonsense. 2 years later, it seems most understand what Tyler Van Dyke is. Now, I will say this, he's not going to read it perfectly. He's not going to process it quickly. And the ball comes out late too often. He's also dealt with multiple arm injuries. However, if you scheme it up for him and he knows exactly where to go pre-snap and that guy is open by even a little bit, the accuracy is good enough and TVD will get the ball on him with zip. So I think there's still some big play potential in his arm. We saw that even last season, right? Van Dyke finished QB 11 out of 165 qualifiers in big-time throw rate, just behind Penix, Hartman, and Drake May. In theory, Van Dyke fits Phil Longo's system really, really well. So, on paper, it's a good match. Now, you mentioned it, word is that TVD didn't run away and hide with the job in spring, but I did hear Van Dyke looked much better the final 10 days or so of camp, and I think that's a positive. You'd think things look better in fall with another 4 months of his head in the playbook. I don't really love the weapons. Will Pauling, nice volume guy that lived in the slot on 97% of snaps and runs good underneath routes. To me, poor man's version of Xavier Restrepo, and I mentioned that because Restrepo was Van Dyke's favorite weapon, and the two had a great rapport, they're in a great relationship, they're roommates at Miami, so Pauling can fit that role. Bryson Green transferred in from Oklahoma State last season. Accumulated respectable stats because he started outside in an air raid offense that trailed a lot, so I'd hope 400 yards is obtainable with those variables. Maybe he makes a year 4 leap. Quincy Burrows, 3-star kid that followed the Cincinnati regime to Wisconsin, year 3 for him. Meh. CJ Williams heads into year 3 as well. He transferred from USC last season. Not great. You follow the tea leaves, and Wisconsin added a 3-star wide receiver in Joseph Griffin from BC in the middle of May. Big body, 6'3" guy, played below replacement level the last 2 seasons at Boston College. I don't really love the weapons here. Luke Fickell has said multiple times this offseason that the offensive line is the most improved group on the entire team. I think that probably makes sense. Our sentiment last season was the group impacted most by the 180 scheme shift would be the big fellas up front. And you think about Wisconsin, recruiting those 330-pound road graders for their run-heavy offense. Now they wanted guys with quicker feet that had to get out of their set a little bit faster. I will say this. I was a little surprised. I thought that unit exceeded our projections last season. And you look between Tanner Mordecai and Braden Locke, Wisconsin's O-line allowed a pressure rate under 25%, and when Wisconsin did run it, only 11% of runs were stuffed. So I thought, all things considered, the offensive line wasn't terrible last year for just a complete scheme shift. Running back room loses Braylon Allen. Good back, but some didn't think he was a total scheme fit. Ches Malusi returns for year 6. Word is Ches is in the best shape of his life. Looked great in spring. Let's see if he can actually stay healthy. Tyree Walker transfers in from Oklahoma. I like him a little bit, right? He's got good vision and patience. Really difficult to bring down because he's built like a bowling ball at 5'9", 225. If you look among 157 running backs with at least 100 carries last season, Walker was 17th in elusiveness. He is a great phone booth runner. He just kind of lacks that extra gear to be explosive and turn those 8, 10, 12-yard runs into 40, 50, and 60. My vibe here is the offense won't look as disjointed as last season, and when the dust settles and you adjust for opponent, Wisconsin will be more efficient in an Excel sheet. But it wouldn't be at all surprising if the record is similar or potentially worse than last season because Oregon and Bama and Penn State are on the schedule. You have, the trip across country to USC. Wisconsin, has to visit the House of Horrors that is Kinnick Stadium along with a rowdy Nebraska crowd. And heck, Wisconsin needed overtime to beat Nebraska in Camp Randall last season. Even the perceived easier road games have quirks to them. Rutgers, we're projecting to have a top 25-ish type defense, right? Does it finish 30th or 28th or 24th? They're in that range. How windy will the Northwestern game be for Phil Longo's air raid offense? There have been buy orders on Minnesota's win total over as well, right? So, there's some interesting stuff with this schedule. I think Wisconsin has to be 3-2 or better heading to New Jersey, or Fickell's going to be feeling some heat there heading into 2025.
When we look at the other side of the ball, Brad, Mike Tressel has a couple of key contributors back, a lot of optimism about what this team can provide from the back end when you have players like Hunter Wooler returning at safety, Ricardo Hallman at cornerback. Some talk that this may be one of the best defensive backfields in the entire conference, but that doesn't make up for an entire defense that has other questions to answer. And when we begin to look at Wisconsin's front seven, at least for me, there are more questions that have to be answered and a lot of productivity that's going to need to be filled with some players that weren't exactly at their best from start to finish last year, and they'll have a whole heap of fresh faces in the mix as well.
Yeah, last year, okay. I mean, keep in mind you're not facing a gauntlet of great offenses in the Big Ten West. Top 25 in yards per play, top 40 in yards per game, 21 in scoring. But, I mean, you compare that to what, when Wisconsin was winning 9-10 games a year, obviously it's a fall off from what we saw 4 or 5 years previously. As far as what they got coming back, you mentioned it, 7 returning starters, production's there in the top 25 in the country. Tressel's back, Mike Tressel's back for his second year as a defensive coordinator. So there's some bits and pieces. You mentioned the secondary to work with. What I'm concerned is up front. At defensive tackle, you got James Thompson back, but they were expected to return a couple more guys, and they just so happened to transfer to LSU and Texas A&M, respectfully. Obviously, those two schools got out the checkbook, and Wisconsin couldn't match. So have some concerns there. Daryl Peterson on the outside is more of a rush linebacker with 10 tackles for lost returns. He comes back. And they lose 2 of their top guys at linebacker, but I actually like what Wisconsin did in the portal. Jaheim Thomas from Arkansas, who was originally with Fickell at Cincinnati. You're talking about a guy that had 90 tackles in SEC play last year. Tackett Curtis from USC, who, I mean, you watched him as a true freshman last year thinking, hey, this is going to be a first-team All-Pac-12, borderline All-American type player down the line in his career, and some reason he transfers out of USC, comes to Wisconsin. I think that's a big pickup. Leon Lowry from Syracuse was relatively productive. So what was going to be, I think, a pretty big question mark at linebacker, losing 2 very experienced guys, including Jordan Turner, who left for Michigan State. I thought they answered those questions a little bit. You mentioned the secondary. That'd be the strength because you got a known commodity at cornerback and Hallman. Ricardo Hallman had 7 picks. You could see him flashing even in last year's spring game. Safety, Honey Wooler led the team by far in tackles with 120. Got some stuff to work with there. You also like at least the trend line. You read the tea leaves. Fickell's doing what I was expecting, at least from the fact that he brought in a top 25 freshman class and a top 25 transfer class. That was my expectation for Luke Fickell. Payne mentioned, though, the schedule. Okay, no Ohio State, no Michigan. That's great news. But oh my goodness, you got to play at USC, you play Oregon, you play Penn State, and oh yeah, by the way, the Crimson Tide of Alabama are coming in non-conference. So a top 10 schedule in terms of difficulty for them. Big picture, I echo some of them same sentiments as Payne. You look at Wisconsin for 30 years. I can make the case that outside of Ohio State, they were the second best program in the Big Ten by running the football, playing good defense. What you would expect, okay, got a little stale under Paul Chryst there at the end. You hire a guy like Luke Fickell. Hey, that's a great hire. And the expectation is, okay, you recruit a little bit better. You specifically go out and get better quarterbacks, and you can keep this winning going and maybe be better than what you were there. I haven't seen it. I don't understand the dramatic schematic call to do an air raid in Madison, Wisconsin. Just doesn't make sense from a recruiting aspect. Doesn't make sense from a program aspect. I don't know if that's going to work out, and I don't know how much patience they're going to have here. And we haven't talked about it because we haven't gotten to these other middling programs in the Big Ten. But man, the additions of USC, Oregon, Washington, who does that hurt? Does that hurt Penn State and Michigan, Ohio State? I don't think so, not that much. Who does it hurt? Teams like Wisconsin, teams like Iowa, Minnesota. Those are the types of teams that they get an extra game or two. Any of those teams in the Big Ten West that we're living on, they have a special season, can win 9-10 games. I think those days are over when you add a couple more tough teams to your schedule.
You begin to wonder if losing an identity for Wisconsin when everybody else zigs, you can zag and play that physical brand of football would be something that Luke Fickell would consider going back to if this season was an abject disaster, but we'll get a better indication during a sophomore campaign of exactly what kind of program Wisconsin is going to put forth and if they have the quarterbacks to go out there and execute, especially in inclement weather that we know Camp Randall is synonymous with as you get deeper into more meaningful November football.
They didn't need to zig or zag. They just needed to be patient. Right, and sometimes when the market
patience is a virtue lost on college. Patience is a virtue lost on college football programs in the year 2024.
The market was making this massive shift towards spread offenses, which meant defenses, right, had to adjust and adapt. Right, all these positions we've talked about, Lion, Husky, right, like you're getting smaller defenses, and so.
Line it up and run right at these teams.
Right. Yeah. You would have been the difference. And these defenses are adapting to 10 teams on the schedule. You would have been somewhat unique. And that was my point at the top. It's like, what happens, and who knows if he lasts this long, but we've kind of hinted at this. Like at some point, whether it's before next season, 18 months, 24 months, the NCAA is going to start paying these players. And yes, the premium guys, right? The top 5 guys on the roster, the top 5 guys in the recruiting class, 1 or 2 transfers are going to be making massive NIL money. But the vast majority of the roster is going to be making more money from the NCAA than it would make to transfer. And so when there's not as many people in the transfer portal and you're Wisconsin attempting to go to this wide open offense and all the athletes are in South Florida, like you can pick, right, just off a tree, an undersized 4-star wide receiver that can play. And so it's like, how are you obtaining these players in the Midwest? And so I think that's what's interesting to me. And I know we're going to talk about a couple of these teams. And Brad mentioned, the inclusion of all these new Pac-12 teams kind of lowering the slot. I would make the case that when you start sitting here talking about Indiana and Michigan hiring 2 offensive coaches, two new coaches rather, that we really love and respect, maybe the gap on those bottom teams aren't as far away from the likes of a Wisconsin when we think about it that way as well.
Well, you mentioned some of those teams that are bringing in new head coaches and a new look Big Ten, Indiana and Michigan State being 2 of them. UCLA has a new boss as well and a familiar name for those folks who followed the Bruins program. So I'll throw it right back to you guys. Curt Cignetti comes over from JMU to take over an Indiana program that had kind of lost its way over the last couple of seasons. Cignetti has won everywhere he's been, and Indiana has almost been college football purgatory other than a season that Tom Allen got the best out of Michael Penix. Here or there, lost in the shuffle. Michigan State has fallen on hard times over the last couple of seasons, so what do? They bring in Jonathan Smith from Corvallis and Oregon State, and while it may be a rocky ground zero, or year zero, I mean, we're talking about Aiden Childs, a very talented quarterback that they think they can get the most out of. So of those 3 programs bringing in new head coaches, is there one that you think something stands out in terms of trying to identify achievable goals in year 1, knowing that all 3 of those programs can be headed in the right direction for year 2 and beyond?
Brad, I'll let you start.
Yeah, I'm going to go with Indiana has the most year 1 success, at least relative to expectation. I had some doubts. I mean, when everybody was hitting the portal for them, and obviously hadn't performed well since that 2020 COVID season, I was like, how does this team get the bowl eligibility? Because Marcos priced them at 5.5. Then I saw what Cignetti brought in, and we're going to get a good idea on how, a very good group of 5 program. How would they compare in playing Big Ten or SEC football? Well, we're going to see that because basically that's what Indiana is a good group of 5 program because they brought in 18 starters basically from James Madison and other places like Ohio, Curtis Rourke, and all these other ones. They went for production over potential. So they got a lot of guys that were very productive and successful at the group of 5 level. We'll see how that translates to the Big Ten football. I had my doubts early. I went to the spring game, saw it live, saw it in person. I thought I maybe not a big mistake, but I'll just say this. I would not be betting under 5.5 wins no longer after watching Indiana. Cignetti's pretty confident, borderline cocky. And you know what? You look at the schedule, I think they're going to be okay. Now, long-term wise, I'm buying Michigan State, Jonathan Smith, if they have patience. I love Jonathan Smith. Not buying it for this year, but long-term, I'm buying that. UCLA, I'm not buying short-term. I'm selling short-term, and I'm probably going to be selling long-term too. Not buying UCLA whatsoever.
I know they were put in a tough spot, but going the Deshaun Foster route to keep it in the UCLA family was a little bit surprising, to say the least, to me.
Listen, I think, ending there, of the three coaches you've asked about, like, clearly Deshaun Foster is the largest question mark and comes with the most variance because he's never done it, right? We don't have like a reference point like we do with Cignetti or Smith. And you just think about Deshaun Foster, the guy was like a GA in 2015. And so I don't think if it's his alma mater.
Meteoric rise, Payne. Meteoric rise.
Yeah, I mean, if it's not his alma mater hiring him, like, I doubt he has the opportunity to be a P4 coach anywhere else, right? And, year one's going to suck.
Even a coordinator, not even
year one's going to suck, right? I mean, like, UCLA has one of the largest year-over-year increases in schedule difficulty. What I am interested to see, though, is, like, what the offense looks like. What's the team? Because Deshaun Foster is a former running back. You hire Eric Bieniemy, former running back. You have a defensive coordinator who's like a former safety / linebacker known for being one of the hardest hitters in his day. And I almost wonder if UCLA wants to be this run-heavy program, and playing some games now in the Midwest helps better recruit that type of player. Obviously, UCLA is going to recruit its backyard, and clearly California is a good state for quarterbacks, and they have a very nice one. And a 4-star lined up in the 2025 class. But, there's more physicality in other regions. It's kind of hilarious bouncing around watching different spring games. And I watch USC's, and don't get me wrong, like, I like Lincoln Riley and the Trojan offense, and that's his one redeeming quality. But the game's fucking pity-pat, two-hand touch, right? And then I flip on Oregon's spring game, and it's like Dan Lanning, who spent 7 years in the South under Nick Saban and Mike Norvell and Kirby Smart. It's running one of the most physical spring games that I watched all offseason. And so I wonder if UCLA actually having more face time in the Midwest would at least be conducive to this potential new style of running back, which, running game, which you would think when you have your head coach and OC as former running backs, would make some sense. Brad mentioned Cignetti, and boy, the confidence is off the charts. He pulled the old I win, Google me card. And then
Brad, we haven't heard that card pulled since Payne Insider pulled it in the middle of last season.
I also think, like, the transition for Cignetti might not be as large as people think when you think about, taking 31 transfers. Brad hit on that perfectly. Like, 13 of them are coming from James Madison. So that certainly helps when players in the locker room are helping kind of permeate the culture you want to establish. 5 more from the Sun Belt. So, Cignetti directly scouted and played against those players. And then the schedule is very manageable. Favored in 3 of the first 4 games. You avoid Penn State, Oregon, and USC. And if you do, like, a quick stock arrow game on Indiana's schedule, like, UCLA is down, Maryland's down, Washington down, Michigan State down, like Purdue and Northwestern, flat. Michigan is obviously down, but that feels like a different tier still. But I think Cignetti provides hope again that you can kind of get back to those 2019-2020 seasons. And I think that's the long-term goal at Indiana, if you can kind of be that program that, in those 2 years won 14 out of 21 games. And Michigan State for us, right? I mean, we're big believers in Jonathan Smith, and so that is that's going to be an interesting program. And kind of, I was thinking of Michigan State when I said, hey, Brad mentioned the additions of Washington and UCLA, or Washington and USC rather, being hindrances to the Iowas and Wisconsins. I almost think, you give this long enough rope, Michigan State's going to be one of those teams that maybe gives problems to the Iowas and the Wisconsins if Jonathan Smith is. I think you give him 4 or 5 years. I really do.
Agree.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to take some time to build that program back to what it was at its peaks under Coach D'Antonio when they were getting to college football playoffs with quarterback talent that was questionable in Connor Cook. But Smith has been able to get the most out of the position. His teams at Oregon State established an identity. Don't think we're going to see it in the first season in East Lansing. But to your point, if they're patient and allow him to build a program the way he needs to, I think Michigan State will be just fine. One other program I wanted to ask you about, Brad, specifically is Northwestern. One of our longest listeners of the podcast. I'm sure he's tuned in for all 2.5 hours plus when we look at the clock right now. Wondering what you do with Northwestern. We talked a little bit about Kansas and how they're not going to have a home field advantage playing away from campus all season. Northwestern will go the opposite route. They'll still be on campus, but it'll be a unique venue to say the least. And you have to imagine watching weather reports in Evanston will take on even added importance, knowing that there is no protection for this makeshift venue right along Lake Michigan.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not exaggerating by any stretch of the imagination. Anybody could throw a rock from the field to Lake Michigan. Anybody. I mean, that's how close it is. And if you don't believe me, I literally was just there a couple months ago, took a video, and it's 10 feet from the lake there. So what does it do for Northwestern's home field advantage? Well, they really never had that much of a home field advantage. You ever watch their games against like Ohio State and Wisconsin?
It might keep the opposing fans away, Brad. Maybe that's where it works in their favor.
That's very sharp because, obviously it's going to be a pretty stringent ticket policy. I think it's only going to hold like 15,000. You might have 90% Northwestern fans for a change. So I don't think it changes that much as far as, I'm going to downgrade their home field advantage to a couple of points. Not going to be the case. Where it does play a factor is you're going to be reading weather reports religiously because it is right on the lake. And last I checked, they don't call it the Windy City for nothing.
The biggest question I have, Brad, do we think we'll see a potential celebration if Northwestern pulls off a big upset? Even if it's in late October, early November, where the entire team decides to jump into a frigid Lake Michigan? Well, that could be unique in and of its own right.
They're going to have to walk a little bit and get to the sand because there's rocks, and I wouldn't be jumping in from the rocks.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a rocky outcropping there, and Lake Michigan may not provide the best avenue to try and take that swim, but a unique venue to say the least. It almost reminds me of what we've seen with Hawaii playing in their temporary facility where we know the winds got cranked up there to high levels on a week-in, week-out basis compared to when they played in Aloha Stadium.
I know. It's starting to get word. It's starting to travel that you're going to have to be first to the punch. You're going to have to be looking at the screen, the weather screen and the odds screen because there's going to be a lot of movement on Northwestern totals at home this year.
It should be interesting to watch. All the kind of wrinkles that we look for some of those unique home field advantages or lack thereof for a program that had a surprising season last year. We'll see if they're able to get to that 6-win threshold and go bowling in 2023. All right, gentlemen, 10 Big Ten programs, deep dive to the best of our abilities. We've covered a ton of ground today, like we have on each of the first 2 Power 4 podcasts, the SEC on deck. But before we start to shift our focus to the preeminent conference in all of college football, best bet portion of the program. And Mr. Payne, what have we seen in the college football landscape to help our loyal Bet the Board listeners build out their portfolios before the season gets here?
I almost did this last year, and it didn't come to fruition, but I like this angle a little bit better than I did last year, and handicap the handicapper, so to speak, and then apply it to the market. And on my walk the other day, and if you haven't listened, you should tune in. All the conference, G5 conference previews are out. Brad did an excellent job there. I'm listening to the Mountain West, and I'm anticipating him giving out Boise State over 8.5. I'm like, it's coming. It's coming. It never came. And now the market is 9.5. And I don't really want to be in a world where you got to go 10-1 to win that win total now. So how do we buy Boise State at this point? One thing that's interesting is, when Brad gave out over 8.5 wins and moved it to 9.5, the win total market has moved 70, 80, 90 cents some places. The correlation to that in winning the Mountain West has only moved 10 or 15 cents, and I don't think that's enough. I also think you have the ability to be the toughest Smurf, so to speak, in the Mountain West, right? San Jose State, Air Force, Wyoming, all down, UNLV, flat, San Diego State with Mr. Sean Lewis probably a year too early. And so I think it makes sense going with Boise to win the Mountain West. You can get plus $1.35 at any MGM property, Circa, you name it. So I think there's still an ability to buy Boise this season and do it in a little bit different manner than the win total. Brad, I know you're bullish on Boise State this year.
Yeah, to say the least. I think we're holding that one. Look, we love Bet the Board listeners. Love them. I was just holding that in the chamber for some others get them. But I made it pretty clear that if there was a second best bet, that was going to be the one there. I have bet this. I bet Boise State to win the Mountain West. And just to put in perspective, right now, coming into the season on a neutral field, I have them more than a touchdown favorite over anybody else in the Mountain West. And we have some comparison. We see that in one other conference. Conference USA, where Liberty's more than a touchdown favorite on a neutral field over anybody else in Conference USA. And what is Liberty priced at in the conference futures markets? How about minus 165, minus 170? No plus number next to their name. Not saying that Boise State should have a minus number next to their name, but I think this should be much, much closer to even money. So I have made this bet. Personally, love it. A lot of experience coming back. A lot of high-level experience if the guys pan out at quarterback and wide receiver. And I like the coaching staff, particularly Cutter calling the offensive plays. I got Boise in the playoffs, so I love it.
We can only hope that Boise can go out there, do some things, and that the voters, or however the hell they're setting up the 12-team college football playoff, gives Boise the nod over a potentially undefeated Liberty team, given what we saw from Liberty last year and a softer schedule. I just want to know, Brad, are you already nervous about Boise's trip to Notre Dame on October 4th in 2025 when you guys have to play a talented G5 program?
Yeah, I mean, if... we'll see. This will be a big year for Marcus Freeman. Trust factor with me. Right now, he's on shaky ground.
BP on the fence. A win over Texas A&M week 1 in College Station against Mike Elko go a long way in terms of putting Marcus Freeman and letting Brad hold him in his highest regards. Anything else you gentlemen would like to share before we close up shop on the Big Ten and reconvene next week to talk a little SEC?
There was only one mention of a jab you were trying to take at me with one of my beloved defensive minds. He wasn't actually mentioned when we broke the team down. You mentioned Alex Grinch.
Yeah, I mean, I took a jab there. I said USC upgraded because they gave Grinch his walking papers.
Well, I mean, the same problem that he had at USC in year 1 seems to be the same problem that USC is having in year 3, the defensive line. But what was interesting was Brad mentioned how did Wisconsin get Tacker Curtis? He has an affinity.
Oh, yeah, you're right.
He has an affinity for Alex Grinch, who's the new safeties coach at Wisconsin.
Good point.
I'm going to be interested to see if Grinch can restore his reputation with a strong performance, because that group is one of the most talented on the Wisconsin roster, like Brad highlighted. So if they completely crater this year compared to what we saw last year, I'm pointing my finger directly at Alex Grinch. Plain and simple. Right. Only one man to blame for the job. But all right, guys, great job as always. Appreciate everything that you guys do for our listeners. And for all you listeners out there, rate, review, subscribe, share the podcast with your friends, family, coworkers, everybody. The more people that listen, the better for the Bet the Board brand. And again, SEC on deck. Every other conference already previewed. Go back, listen into the archives. Brad did an outstanding job, as Payne said, with the G5. The three of us have now previewed 3 of the 4 Power 4 conferences, and with 1 left to go, still plenty of ground to cover. Best of luck with all of your Big Ten investments this season, but most importantly, we wavered a little bit from the Big Ten, headed to the Mountain West with a Boise State to win the Mountain West Conference ticket in hand. We'll see you at the window.
We hope you enjoyed listening to this episode of Bet the Board. Make sure you follow Todd and Payne on X. Todd is at Todd Fuhrman. That's TODDFUHRMAN. And Payne is at Payne Insider. That's PAYNEINSIDER. Don't forget, our weekly newsletter comes with an additional best bet. Have that delivered to your inbox by clicking the link atop the podcast show notes. And most importantly, subscribe and download Bet the Board. We're on Apple, Spotify, Amazon Wondery, YouTube, Google Podcasts, and all your other major platforms.